She had 30 minutes to live, and she knew it. The wind didn't howl that night, it screamed. It tore across the Wyoming high country like something ancient and furious, ripping snow from the frozen ground and hurling it sideways through the dark. The temperature had dropped 22 degrees in under 2 hours. The sky had turned the color of wet iron, and Nora Calloway was walking directly into the heart of it, alone, half frozen, carrying nothing but a canvas bag and a secret she didn't yet know she was carrying. She had come west looking for a future. What she found instead was a man named Dorian Voss, and the cold, deliberate truth that he had never wanted a wife at all. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far Nora's story travels. And if you stay until the end, you'll understand why some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds are stacked against you. Hit that like button and let's begin. But the wind didn't howl, it screamed. It came off the Absaroka range like something that had been waiting up there all autumn, patient and mean, storing its fury for exactly this kind of night. By the time it reached the valley floor, it had already killed 2 elk in a half-frozen creek, and it was just getting started. Nora Calloway walked into it with her head down and her coat pulled tight across her chest, which did almost nothing. The coat was wool mid-weight, purchased second-hand from a garment shop in Pittsburgh before she left Pennsylvania 3 weeks ago. It was built for cold, not for this. Not for a Wyoming blizzard in the second week of December, with drifts building waist-high against the fence lines and visibility so poor she could barely see her own boots. She had been walking for 2 hours. She knew that because she'd checked the small watch pinned to her dress, her mother's watch, the only thing of value she owned when she'd left the Voss property. It had read 4:15. Now it read 6:30. And the sky, what little she could see of it through the roiling white, had gone fully dark. The town of Blackwater Ridge was behind her. She'd tried the boarding house first. The proprietress, a square-shouldered woman named Mrs. Grady, had looked her up and down from the doorway with an expression like she was inspecting damaged goods. "Full up," she'd said, and closed the door before Nora could finish her sentence. The hotel had been more direct. The clerk, a thin man with ink-stained fingers and no apparent conscience, had quoted her a room rate that was twice what she had in her pocket. When she'd explained her situation carefully without drama, just the plain facts, he'd nodded once and suggested she try the church. The church was locked, so Nora had walked north along the valley road because north was the only direction she hadn't tried yet, and because a ridge hand she'd passed on the trail had mentioned 3 days ago, before everything collapsed, that there were ranches up that way. Working spreads, people who might need help or at least have a barn. She hadn't told anyone where she was going because there was no one left to tell. The snow was above her knees now in places. She couldn't feel her feet. Her hands, shoved deep into her pockets, had progressed through pain and cold and arrived somewhere past both a dull, distant numbness that she recognized dimly as dangerous. She'd read about frostbite once in a medical pamphlet at the mill. She knew what came after numbness. She walked faster. The thought she kept returning to, the one she used to keep moving, was not hope exactly. It was something harder than hope. It was the specific memory of standing at her machine in the Callaway Textile Works at 5:30 in the morning, age 19, watching the woman beside her cough blood into her sleeve and then return to work because there was no other choice. That woman had been 43 years old and looked 60. She had worked at the mill for 20 years. Nora had decided that day that she would not die by increments. She had saved for 2 years. She had answered the advertisement, "Rancher seeks respectable woman," for partnership and home references, provided passage arranged, and she had made the journey west on a train that smelled like coal smoke and other people's hope, watching Pennsylvania give way to Ohio, give way to the vast, flat indifference of the plains before the mountains finally rose up on the horizon like a promise she hadn't dared to speak aloud. She had arrived at the Voss property on a Tuesday. She had been asked to leave on a Friday. 3 days. That was how long it had taken Dorian Voss to look at her across his dining room table and decide she wasn't what he'd ordered. She was thinking about that, about the specific expression on his face when he'd said it, that flat, assessing look, like she was livestock that had failed inspection when she saw the light. It was faint, far off to the east, barely visible through the wall of the driving snow. Just a warm yellow glow in a window, unsteady with what might have been firelight. It could have been a quarter mile away. It could have been more. Nora changed direction without thinking. She climbed through two fence lines and crossed what she later understood had been a frozen creek, though she didn't know it at the time. She just knew the ground dipped and rose and the snow was suddenly harder underfoot. Her lungs burned. Her legs had stopped feeling like legs and started feeling like something borrowed from someone else. The light got brighter. A cabin took shape out of the darkness, low-roofed, stone-chimneyed, with a porch that faced south. There was a barn to the east, and she could hear horses moving inside it, restless in the storm. Smoke rose from the chimney and was immediately torn apart by the wind. She made it to the porch steps. She had just enough left to climb them. She knocked 3 times. Not loudly. She didn't have loud left in her, just 3 soft taps with knuckles that barely bent anymore. Nothing. She knocked again. Slower. Weaker. Knock, knock, knock. The door opened. Eli Strand had been expecting the storm to do something stupid. 34 winters in these mountains had taught him that the land had moods, and this particular storm had been in a bad one since morning. He'd checked the horses twice, already reinforced the barn door latch, stacked enough wood inside the cabin to last 4 days. He'd done everything a man could do to prepare, and now he was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee, gone cold, and a saddle in pieces in front of him, waiting for the wind to decide whether it wanted to take the roof or just rattle it. He was not expecting a woman on his porch. When he opened the door and found her there, his first thought was that he'd imagined it. His second thought, arriving almost simultaneously, was that she was going to die if he didn't move immediately. She was bone white. Her lips had gone the color of bruises. Ice clung to her hair in jagged crystals, and her coat, thin worn, hanging open because her fingers had stopped being able to work the buttons, was soaked through. Beneath it, a dark dress also soaked. She held a canvas bag in one hand, gripping it with the kind of desperate grip that had nothing to do with strength and everything to do with sheer refusal to let go. Her eyes found his, dark eyes, desperate, already halfway to gone. "Please," she whispered. Eli didn't ask who she was, didn't ask why she was there or where she'd come from or what she wanted. He'd ask those questions later, when asking them wouldn't get her killed. He reached out, took her by the arm. She was so light it startled him, and pulled her inside. The door slammed behind them. The wind cut off like a severed scream. She collapsed. He caught her before she hit the floor. His arms went under hers, and he felt the full extent of what the storm had done to her. The violent shaking, the shallow, rattling breaths, the skin that felt like it had been packed in ice. She weighed almost nothing. He carried her to the chair closest to the stove and set her down with care that surprised him, because care was not something he'd practiced in a long time. "Can you hear me?" His voice came out rough. He hadn't used it much that day. She nodded. "Barely." "Good. Stay awake." He worked fast. He'd pulled half-frozen calves out of snowbanks before, and he knew exactly how fast cold could kill, how deceptive the warmth felt just before the end. He unlaced her boots. They were frozen solid, stiff as boards, and pulled them off. Her feet inside were gray-white, the color that preceded blackening. He grabbed the wool blanket from the back of the couch and wrapped it around her shoulders. "Arms up." She tried. Her hands wouldn't cooperate. Her fingers had curled inward like claws, stiff and unresponsive. Eli worked around them. He peeled off her coat, then the shawl underneath, moving with the efficiency of someone who understood that hesitation was a form of cruelty right now. The dress beneath was soaked through, clinging to her. He paused for a fraction of a second. "Can you get the dress off yourself?" She stared at him. The glassiness in her eyes was starting to thin. The warmth of the stove was reaching her slowly. "The dress," he said again, slower. "It's wet. You need it off or you'll freeze sitting right here." Understanding flickered across her face. She nodded and reached for the buttons with trembling hands. Her fingers slipped uselessly over the fabric. She tried again. Failed again. A sound escaped her somewhere between frustration and despair. Eli exhaled. "Turn around." She did. He unfastened the long row of buttons down her back with quick, impersonal movements, the same way he'd untangle barbed wire or unlatch a frozen gate. When the last one came free, he stepped back and turned away. "There's a dry shirt on the bed. Put it on. Get back by the stove." He heard the wet fabric hit the floor, heard her cross to the bed, uneven and slow. A minute later, she was back in the chair, wrapped in his flannel shirt and the wool blanket, her bare legs tucked beneath her. Eli poured coffee, pressed the cup into her hands. Drink slow. She did. The first sip made her wince. She kept going, holding the cup like it was the last solid thing in the world. He crouched in front of her and studied her face in the firelight. Young late 20s maybe. Dark hair plastered wet against her neck. Eyes that looked too old for the rest of her. There was a bruise along her jaw, faint but there the yellowish kind that was a week old. Her hands wrapped around the cup were raw in the way that came from work and weather, and not enough of either warmth or rest. "What's your name?" he asked. "Nora." The word came out barely above a whisper. "Nora Calloway." "Where'd you come from, Nora Calloway?" Her gaze dropped to the cup. "The Voss property." Eli went still. He knew that name. Everyone in the valley knew that name. Dorian Voss owned more land between here and the Territorial Railroad than any other single man in Wyoming cattle range water rights, grazing contracts, timber leases. He was wealthy in the way that had stopped being about money a long time ago and become about power. He was untouchable in the way that powerful men in isolated places sometimes became when there was no one close enough or brave enough to question them. Eli kept his voice flat. "You walked from Voss's property. In this." "I didn't have a choice." "Why not?" She looked up at him then, and the expression in her eyes was something Eli recognized the way you recognize a scar, not from looking at it, but from having worn one yourself. It was the look of someone who had been thrown away and told it was their own fault. "Because he didn't want me," she said. The words came out simple and final, like she'd already done all the crying about it that she was going to do. Eli stood, crossed to the stove, gave himself a moment with his back to her. Outside, the wind hammered the cabin walls with the persistence of something personal. He'd seen storms drive animals to do strange things, panic run in circles, walk straight off ledges into nothing. But a person walking 15 miles through a blizzard didn't do it from panic. They did it because staying was worse than dying. And if Dorian Voss had turned a woman out into weather like this, it meant he'd wanted her gone in a way that didn't leave questions behind. He turned back to her. "You're a mail-order bride." It wasn't a question. She nodded once. "I was." "What happened?" She took another sip of coffee. Her hands were steadier now, though still shaking. "I came west because I answered an advertisement. A rancher looking for a wife. Someone respectable," the letter said. "Someone to build a life with." Her mouth twisted. "That's what it said. And Voss sent it. His name was on it, though I've since wondered." She stopped, shook her head slightly. "When I arrived, he took one look at me and decided I wasn't worth the investment." His exact phrase. He said I was too plain, too quiet, that he'd made a mistake and wouldn't be held to it. Eli's jaw tightened. "When did he tell you this afternoon?" "In the middle of a blizzard. He said the weather wasn't his problem, that if I'd been worth keeping, it wouldn't have mattered." She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Her voice had gone flat, not emotionless, but controlled the way voices went when the emotion was still there, but the person had decided they weren't going to let it show. "He gave me $20 and told me to leave. I tried the boarding house in town, the hotel. Both turned me away. So I started walking. And you saw my light from the ridge. 2 miles off, maybe more." She met his eyes. "I know I'm asking a great deal of a complete stranger." Eli looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You can stay." She stared at him. Surprise moved across her face like a sudden change in weather. "What?" "Tonight, until the storm clears. After that, we'll figure it out." He paused. "I don't have money to offer you." "I didn't ask for money." "No, you didn't." He held her gaze. "Nobody deserves to feast to death for being inconvenient." Something shifted behind her eyes. Relief maybe, or disbelief, or the very fragile beginning of trust, the kind that came not from being charmed, but from being treated like a person. She nodded once, slow and deliberate. "Thank you," she said. Eli grunted and turned back to the stove. He pulled a cast-iron skillet from its hook, set it on the heat-sliced salt pork, and dropped it in to sizzle. The smell filled the cabin, rich, savory, real. He added beans from the pot he'd made that morning, stirred them together, split the portion onto 2 tin plates. He handed her one and sat across from her at the table. They ate in silence. The only sounds were the scrape of forks, the crackle of the stove, and the muffled fury of the storm trying to get in. Nora ate slowly at first, like her stomach wasn't sure it remembered how, then faster. When she finished, she set the plate down with careful precision. "I haven't had a meal like that in 3 days," she said. Eli looked up. "Voss didn't feed you." "Not after he decided I wasn't staying." The word came out of him before he decided to say it. "Bastard." Nora glanced up startled, but Eli's expression hadn't changed. He just stood, collected the plates, and dropped them in the wash basin. "You'll take the bed," he said. "I can't take your bed. You just walked 15 miles through a blizzard. You'll take the bed." She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Okay." He banked the fire, checked the door latch, pointed toward the loft. "Up the ladder. Extra blankets in the chest if you need them." Nora stood swaying slightly but steadier than she'd been an hour ago and made her way to the ladder. She climbed slowly each rung, a deliberate effort, and disappeared into the darkness above. Eli pulled a bedroll from the storage chest, spread it on the floor near the stove, and lay down with his boots still on. He stared at the ceiling beams. He should have asked more questions, should have thought harder about what it meant to bring a woman into his home, a woman Victor Voss had thrown out, which meant a woman Victor Voss might come looking for. Should have calculated the risk with the cool, methodical precision he'd spent 8 years cultivating. He hadn't done any of that. He'd just opened the door and pulled her in. He closed his eyes and listened to the storm try to tear the world apart outside, and above him he could hear the soft, even breathing of a woman who had almost died and hadn't. And for reasons he couldn't have explained and didn't try to, that seemed like enough. The storm didn't stop. It raged through the night and into the next day, piling snow higher than the windowsills and turning the world into a white roaring void that had no edges and no end. Eli went out twice to check the horses breaking trail through drifts that came up to his chest. The cold was brutal in the specific way of high-altitude winters, not just temperature, but pressure, like the air itself was trying to compress you into something smaller. He moved through it with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd learned to read the mountain the way other men read faces, and came back in both times carrying ice in his beard and an expression that gave nothing away. Nora stayed inside. She moved through the cabin carefully, the way she moved everywhere, as though she was always conscious of how much space she was taking up and whether she'd been given permission for it. She folded the blankets. She washed the dishes from the night before, found the dishcloth, and hung it near the stove to dry. When the fire burned low, she stoked it without being asked, adding 2 logs from the stack near the door at exactly the right interval to keep the temperature steady. Eli watched her from the corner of his eye while he worked at the table and noticed things. She was efficient, thorough. She didn't make unnecessary movements. She didn't talk unless she had something worth saying. Those were qualities he respected. They were also qualities that told a particular kind of story, the story of someone who had spent a long time in circumstances where wasting time or making noise had consequences. "You don't have to do that," he said, nodding toward the firewood stack she was reorganizing near the stove. She glanced at him. "I want to help. You're a guest. I'm a burden." "No," he said. His voice was firm in the way of someone who didn't use firmness carelessly. "You're not." She stopped. Her hands rested on a split log, and she looked at him directly, the first time she'd done that since the night before. Her eyes were sharper in the daylight, more present. The desperate glassiness was gone. "Why are you helping me?" she asked quietly. "Already told you." "You told me why you let me in. I'm asking why you're letting me stay." Eli set down the leather strap he'd been mending and leaned back in his chair. He considered the question the way he considered most things, without rushing it, without dressing it up in words it didn't need. "Because you don't strike me as someone who runs," he said finally. "You strike me as someone who got pushed, and I don't have much use for men who push." Something moved across her face. Surprise, maybe, or the specific relief of being correctly understood by someone who hadn't been trying to. She looked away, back at the firewood, nodded once. "Thank you," she said softly. "You already said that." "I mean it more now." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but close enough to be the shape of one. They worked in the same space after that, without the awkwardness that usually lived between strangers. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was the kind that accumulated meaning the longer it went on, the kind that said, I am comfortable in the same room as you, which was not a small thing. By the second night, the storm still hadn't broken. Eli made stew venison, potatoes, carrots from the root cellar, and they ate together at the table again. Nora asked about the ranch, and he told her 200 acres, mostly grazing land, a small cattle herd, 6 horses, a barn. He'd rebuilt 3 times because the wind kept trying to claim it. You run it alone? She asked. Yeah. That's a lot of work for one man. It's enough for one man. She studied him across the table. The firelight caught the angles of his face, the strong jaw, the line of his nose, the eyes that were some ambiguous shade between gray and blue and seemed to change depending on what he was thinking. He wasn't handsome exactly. He was the kind of face that had been shaped by weather and work and time into something more durable than handsome. You don't talk much, she said. Not if I do not have to. Why not? Words don't fix fences. Nora almost smiled. The corner of her mouth twitched before she stopped it. No, but they build other things. He looked at her, then really looked with the attention he usually reserved for reading sky and tracking weather, and saw something he hadn't quite registered before. The intelligence in her eyes, the kind of mind that had been sharpened by constraint rather than dulled by it. What did you do before you came west? He asked. I worked in a textile mill, Pittsburgh. 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. Yeah. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. I saved for 2 years to afford the train ticket. Why leave? Oh, yeah, because staying meant dying slowly. Her voice was matter-of-fact. No self-pity in it. She'd already burned through that fuel and moved on to something cleaner. The mill was killing girls my age. Lung sickness, accidents. I watched 3 women collapse at their stations in 1 year. She met his eyes. I decided I'd rather take my chances out here. With an unknown future, I could choose rather than a known one, I couldn't. Eli nodded slowly. He understood that. The specific calculus of choosing the harder unknown over the certain diminishment. He'd made a version of that choice himself 8 years ago, though the circumstances had been different and the cost had been higher. For what it's worth, he said, you made it farther than most would have. I made it to your door half dead. You made it, he said. That's not nothing. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked away and something in the set of her shoulders shifted slightly. Less braced, less defended. What happens when the storm ends? She asked. Depends. On what you want to do. She was quiet for a long time after that, staring into her cup like the answer might be floating in the dark liquid at the bottom. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, certain the way only people who'd thought something through very carefully could be certain. I know one thing, she said. I'm not going back to Voss, to him, or to anyone who thinks they can buy a woman and discard her when she doesn't suit. She paused. Beyond that, I don't know yet. Fair enough, Eli said. They sat in silence after that, the fire burning and the storm howling outside. And in that silence, something settled between them, not a promise exactly, but the shape of one. A mutual understanding that whatever came next, it wouldn't be decided by fear or desperation. On the 3rd day, the wind finally died. The silence woke Eli before dawn. He lay on his bedroll and listened to the absence of sound, no howling, no rattling, shudders, just the faint crackle of embers and the soft, even breathing from the loft above. He stood, pulled on his coat, and stepped outside. The world had been remade. Snow covered everything, smooth white, unbroken in every direction. The pines along the ridge sagged under the weight of it. The sky above was clear and infinite, the kind of cold, dark blue that existed only in the hour before sunrise at altitude. His breath hung in clouds. He walked to the barn. The horses were fine, restless, but fine. He fed them, checked their hooves, mucked the stalls while the sun climbed slowly over the ridge. When he came back inside, Nora was awake. She'd come down from the loft and was standing at the window, wrapped in the blanket, watching the snow-covered valley below. The morning light came through the glass and caught her profile, the straight nose, the determined line of her jaw, the bruise that was finally starting to fade. She turned when he entered. It's over, he said. She nodded slowly. What happens now? Now we dig out, clear the paths, make sure nothing got damaged. He poured coffee, handed her a cup. After that, you decide. Decide what? Whether you leave or stay. She took the coffee, her hands wrapped around it with the same steadiness that had been growing in her over the past 2 days, the steadiness of someone who had been through the worst thing and come out the other side of it, still standing. If I stay, she said carefully, what does that mean? Means you work, same as me. Pull your weight, earn your keep. He met her eyes. Not as a servant, as a partner. The word hung in the air between them. Why would you offer me that? She asked. Because I could use the help. He paused. And because you've already proven you don't run from hard work. Another pause. But it's your choice. No obligation. No strings. Nora looked at him for a long time, searching his face with the careful attention of someone who had been deceived before and had learned to look past the surface of things. What she found there apparently was enough. I'll stay, she said. Eli nodded. Good. And that was it. No ceremony, no promises, just a decision made and accepted between two people who both understood that the simplest agreements were the ones most likely to hold. They spent the rest of the day digging out. It came 4 days later on a morning so clear and cold the air seemed to ring like struck glass. Eli was outside splitting wood when he heard the hoofbeats. Steady, deliberate coming up from the south. He set down the axe but kept it in his hand and watched as two riders crested the rise. The man in front sat tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered, clean-shaved, wearing a coat that cost more than most men in the valley earned in a full season. His horse was a glossy black gelding, 16 hands, at least the kind of horse you rode when you wanted people to notice you coming. Eli had never met Dorian Voss, but he knew the type. Men like Voss moved through the world as though they'd been given a deed to it at birth and were simply waiting for everyone else to acknowledge the fact. They didn't threaten directly, they just rearranged reality until resistance became inconvenient. The second rider was younger, lean, wiry, with a rifle resting across his saddle horn and eyes that moved over the property with the specific attention of someone inventorying its ten. Voss reined in 10 feet away and looked down at Eli from the saddle. You Eli Strand? I am. Dorian Voss. He didn't offer his hand. I'm told you have something that belongs to me. Eli's expression didn't change. I don't have anything of yours. A woman, dark hair, came through here about 4 days ago. He said it the way you said stray cattle, something that had wandered off its proper place and needed returning. If a woman came through here, she didn't mention your name. Voss's jaw tightened fractionally. Don't play games with me, Strand. I know she's here. Her tracks led straight to your door. Then maybe you should have followed them 4 days ago before the storm covered them. The younger man's hand drifted toward his rifle. Voss raised one gloved finger, a small, unhurried gesture, and the hand stopped. I don't want trouble, Voss said. His voice was smooth, practiced, the voice of a man who had learned to make threats sound like reasonable conversation. I just want what's mine. She's not a horse, Eli said flatly. She's not yours. She signed a contract and accepted compensation. You voided that contract when you threw her out into a blizzard. Eli held his gaze. 2 men in town died in that storm, Voss. You knew what you were sending her into. Something moved behind Voss's eyes. Not shame. Men like Voss had processed their shame into something else long ago, but calculation, reassessment. Let me make this simple, he said. I paid her passage. I paid the arrangement fees. That investment doesn't just disappear because she's inconvenient. If she's here without authorization, and I have legal standing to what? The cabin door opened. Nora stepped out onto the porch. She was wearing the coat Eli had given her, his second-best heavy canvas with a wool lining, and her hair was pulled back. Her chin was raised. She did not look like a woman who had almost died 4 days ago. She looked like a woman who had passed through something and come out harder on the other side. Voss turned in the saddle. His expression shifted, surprise first, then something colder, more complicated. Miss Calloway, he said, I was beginning to think you'd simply disappeared. I didn't disappear, she said. Her voice was steady and clear in the cold air. You tried to make me disappear. There's a difference. I offered you a reasonable settlement. You gave me $20 and pointed me toward a storm that was already killing people. She came down the porch steps, moving with a deliberateness that stopped just short of defiance. That's not a settlement, Mr. Voss. That's a sentence, Maham. Voss looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Eli. "You're staking your ranch on her word against mine," he said. His voice had dropped. The smoothness was still there, but underneath it something had sharpened. "Think carefully about that Strand. I control water rights on 3 of the 4 creeks that feed this valley. I hold supply contracts with every merchant in Blackwater Ridge. If I decide you're not someone worth doing business with, then I'll find another way to do business," Eli said. He kept his voice even, but he took one step forward and the axe came up slightly, not raised, not threatening, just present, just visible. "You send a woman out to die," he said, "and she survives, and you come to my property to take her back, and that's not a business disagreement. That's something else, and I'd encourage you to think carefully about whether you want what that become." Voss stared at him. The younger man's hand had drifted to his rifle again, and this time Voss didn't stop him immediately. The 2 men looked at each other across the snow-bright yard, the rancher with the axe and the landowner on the expensive horse. And the silence between them was the specific silence of 2 people calculating what the other was willing to do. Then Voss pulled his reins and turned his horse in a sharp half circle. "This isn't over," he said. He looked at Nora, not at Eli when he said it. "Yes, it is," Nora said. "I'm not going back with you. Not today, not ever. You didn't want a wife, Mr. Voss. You wanted something else entirely. I just don't know yet what it was." Something flickered across Voss's face at that, just for a moment, just a fraction of a second. Not anger exactly, something more controlled than anger. Something that looked almost like alarm. He spurred the gelding forward, and the younger man followed, and they rode back down the trail without another word. Nora and Eli stood in the snow and watched them disappear over the ridge. The sound of hoofbeats faded. A hawk cried somewhere to the north. Nora let out a slow breath. "He'll be back," she said quietly. "I know." "You shouldn't have—" "I chose this," Eli said. He turned to look at her. "Don't apologize for it." She met his eyes. And in the specific quality of her expression, the way she held his gaze without flinching, the way something in her seemed to settle rather than retreat, he saw something that would take him weeks to name. He was still thinking about it when they went back inside, and he bolted the door against the cold. The first week passed in a rhythm older than words. Eli woke before dawn. Started the fire, went to the barn, while Frost still painted the window glass. Nora rose shortly after, dressed in clothes she'd washed and mended by candlelight, and had coffee waiting when he came back in with snow on his coat and ice in his beard. They ate breakfast without ceremony, oatmeal, salt pork bread she'd learned to make in his cast-iron Dutch oven, and then they worked. She fed the chickens in the lean-to behind the barn. She hauled water from the creek when the pump froze. She learned to split kindling with the hand axe, which was too heavy for her at first, and got lighter every day. When a fence section needed mending, she held the wire while he worked the pliers. When he was doctoring a horse with a swollen fetlock, she stood at the animal's head and spoke to it in a low, steady voice that kept it calm in a way Eli would not have predicted. He watched her figure things out without offering help she hadn't asked for, and she never asked unless she genuinely needed to. By the end of the second week, her hands had blistered, healed, and calloused over. The haunted look in her eyes had begun to fade. She moved through the cabin and the yard with a different kind of ease, not the careful, space-conscious efficiency of someone trying not to impose, but the easy competence of someone who had found their footing. She belonged to herself again. Eli noticed, though he didn't say so. He just moved through the days the way he always had, except now there was someone moving through them with him, and the shape of his solitude had changed without his having decided to change it. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the mountains and turned the snow the color of amber, Nora stood at the window and watched the light fade. Eli sat at the table oiling a saddle. "You're a hard man to figure out, Eli Strand," she said without turning around. "Don't see why you'd need to. Because you saved my life and asked for nothing in return." She turned then. The firelight caught her face. "Most men don't do that. Most men aren't worth much," he said. "Do you include yourself in that?" "I include everyone until they prove otherwise." "And have I proved otherwise?" He looked at her steadily. "You're still here, aren't you?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she turned back to the window and said almost to herself, "Yes, I am." Outside, the stars were coming out over the Wyoming mountains one by one, cold and bright, and indifferent to the small human warmth below. And inside the cabin, two people who had both spent too long disappearing into the noise of other people's expectations were very quietly beginning to be seen. Neither of them spoke about what Nora had said to Voss before he'd ridden away. I don't know yet what it was, but the words stayed with her, moved through her thoughts in the quiet moments while she was hauling water, while she was kneading bread dough, while she lay in the loft at night, listening to the wind come down off the ridge. Voss had not come to his property looking for a wife. She had understood that within the first hour of arriving. The advertisement had been specific, detailed, persuasive, the kind of letter that a man who genuinely wanted a companion wrote. But Dorian Voss in person had been none of those things. He'd been cold, assessing. He'd looked at her the way men looked at maps, not at people. She had assumed it was vanity, disappointment, a shallow man who'd wanted a certain type of woman and received another. But the look on his face when she'd said those words, "You wanted something else entirely," had not been the look of a man caught in vanity. It had been the look of a man caught in something much more serious. She didn't know yet what thread she'd pulled. She didn't know that pulling it would eventually unravel everything. But she remembered it, held it, turned it over in her mind while the Wyoming winter pressed down on the valley and the nights grew longer and the mornings grew colder. And somewhere in the darkness below the ridge, Dorian Voss sat in his study and planned his next move. The sabotage started small. That was the thing about men like Dorian Voss, they never began with fire. They began with inconvenience, a missing tool, a gate left open, a fence section that looked intact but wasn't. Small things, the kind that could be weather or bad luck or simple accident, the kind that left you exhausted and doubting your own memory before you recognized them for what they were. The first incident was the water trough. Eli found it on a Tuesday morning, 2 weeks after Voss's visit. The wooden plug at the base had been loosened, not pulled, just turned enough that the trough had been draining slowly all night. By the time he discovered it, most of the stored water was gone, soaked into frozen ground that couldn't absorb it, leaving the cattle short and adding 2 hours to the morning's work. He plugged it, said nothing. 3 days later, the east fence had a section down. A clean break on the post, the wood splintered in a way that didn't look like wind damage, though he couldn't prove it wasn't. 2 of his younger steers had wandered through before he found it. He spent the afternoon on horseback in sub-freezing temperatures, hunting them across country that didn't want to give them back. He fixed the fence, said nothing. Nora noticed the pattern before he acknowledged it out loud. She was observant in the specific way of someone who had spent years watching for signs of what was coming next, and what she saw in the small daily damages being done to the ranch was not bad luck. On the 4th incident, a bridle found cut through cleanly. With something sharp, she set it on the table in front of him at breakfast and said, "This isn't an accident." Eli looked at the cut leather for a moment, picked up his coffee. "No," he said, "it's not." Voss, probably someone working for him. He won't do it himself. What do? We fix it and we stay alert. He set the cup down. He's looking for a reaction. Something he can point to. We don't give him one. Just absorb it. For now. He met her eyes. Men like Voss are patient when they think they're winning. The moment they feel like they're losing, they get reckless. We wait for reckless. Nora looked at the cut bridle for another moment, then nodded and began clearing the breakfast dishes. But there was something in the way she moved after that, a new quality of alertness, a watchfulness that hadn't been there before. She'd grown up in a mill town, she'd told him. She understood what it meant to have powerful men decide that you were an obstacle. She understood that pretending otherwise didn't make it less true. She just hadn't expected to be an obstacle again so soon. It was during this stretch of watchful days that she first asked him about his past. They were in the barn working side by side in the comfortable efficiency they'd developed without discussion, Eli forking hay, while Nora checked the horse's hooves with the careful attention he'd taught her. The afternoon light came through the slats and pale gold bars, and the horses moved in their stalls with the slow contentment of animals that were warm and fed. "How long have you been here?" she asked. "On this property." 8 years. She didn't say anything for a moment, just worked the hoof pick around the edge of a front shoe. "Then what were you before?" He paused with the pitchfork. "What do you mean before you came here? Before you built this?" She glanced at him. "You didn't grow up on this particular piece of land. Nobody grows up somewhere and then rebuilds the barn 3 times. You grow up somewhere, and the barn was already there. It was the most perceptive thing she'd said to him yet, which was saying something. Eli drove the fork into a hay bale. I had a ranch, further south, down near the Sweetwater. What happened to it? He was quiet for long enough that she looked up again, and in the quality of his silence, she read what kind of answer was coming. I lost it, he said, to Voss. The words came out of her with a flatness that surprised them both. She didn't say it as a question. She said it the way you state something you have already worked out carefully because you're not entirely sure you want to be right. Eli looked at her. Why do you say that, he said, because of the way his name lands on you. She set the hoof down gently and moved to the next horse. Most people hear a powerful man's name and they either flinch or they go blank. You do neither. You go still, like you're managing something, like you've been managing it for a long time. A long silence. Outside, wind moved through the pine tops. One of the horses blew to air through its nose. He didn't take it directly, yai? Eli said finally. Men like Voss don't do direct. He diverted a water source, turned my creek into a seasonal trickle by the time I realized what was happening. Cattle started dying. I borrowed against the land to keep the herd going. He paused. When I couldn't service the debt, the bank called the note. Voss had already talked to the bank. He bought the land at auction for a third of its value. Nora had stopped moving. That's how he works, Eli said. He doesn't steal. He arranges circumstances until you have no choice but to hand things over. And then he looks surprised that you're upset. Was there? She stopped, started again. Was there anyone else at the time? He looked at her steadily. My wife, he said, and a son. He was 4. Nora went still. She left when the ranch went, he said. His voice was even, the evenness of something that had been worked over for a long time until all the jagged parts were smooth. Took the boy back to her family in Missouri. Couldn't blame her. I had nothing left to offer them. He picked up the fork again. I came north, found this land, built the cabin, started over. And Voss has no idea I'm the same man, different county, different name on the deed. He's owned at half this territory for a decade. He doesn't remember every ranch he absorbed. A pause. Or maybe he does and doesn't care. Either way, he hasn't made the connection. Nora was quiet for a moment, looking at the horse in front of her without really seeing it. That changes things, she said. No, it doesn't. Eli, it doesn't change anything about your situation, he said. You're here because he tried to kill you. That's its own reason. What he did to me 8 years ago is separate. Is it? She turned to face him fully. Because if he finds out who you are, then he'll have 2 reasons to push us off this land instead of 1. He met her eyes, but he's already pushing. The reason doesn't change what we do about it. She looked at him for a long moment. All right, she said, not agreement exactly. Acknowledgement, the same acknowledgement she'd given him in the snow 3 weeks ago when he'd told her she could stay. A decision made and accepted. All right, she said again, and went back to work. They rode into Blackwater Ridge on a Saturday morning 2 weeks after Voss's visit. It was Eli's idea and Nora had understood it without him explaining it. Visibility was a form of defense. The valley talked. The valley would talk about her whether she showed herself or not. Better for the talk to be shaped by her own presence rather than by whatever version Voss and his people were already circulating. The town sat in a valley where 3 trails converged. It wasn't large, a general store, a saloon, a smithy, a church with a weather-bent steeple, a post office that was also the telegraph office, and a collection of houses and outbuildings that had grown up around the original trading posts like sediment. But it was the center of everything within 40 miles, which meant that what happened in Blackwater Ridge mattered. Eli pulled the wagon up in front of the general store. People on the street turned to look. A woman riding beside Eli Strand was enough of a novelty to stop conversations. And conversations that had been happening for 2 weeks about who she was and what she was doing there came to a visible pause. Nora kept her chin level and her shoulders back. The mill had beaten the posture out of her once. She'd reclaimed it. Inside the store, it smelled like wood smoke and coffee and dried apples. The proprietor, a thick-shouldered man named Tom Reeves, the closest thing Blackwater Ridge had to a center of gravity, looked up from behind the counter and nodded. Eli, been a while. Tom, Eli set a list on the counter. This is Nora Calloway. She's working the ranch with me. Tom's eyebrows rose a half inch, but his expression stayed neutral, which Nora took as a good sign. Miss Calloway. Mr. Reeves, she held his gaze. Just Tom is fine if that suits you. Something in Tom's face settled almost imperceptibly, a minor recalibration. Just Tom, he agreed and reached for the list. While Tom worked down the shelves, Nora moved through the store. She ran her fingers along bolts of fabric she couldn't afford, examined the jars of preserves, looked at the tools hung on the wall with the eyes of someone who'd spent weeks learning to use most of them. She was examining a set of needles. She needed new ones. Her current ones were nearly worn through when the door opened. Two women walked in. The first was older, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, wearing a coat with a fox fur collar that was meant to establish something. The second was younger, blonde, pretty, with the particular kind of confidence that came from having always been the most attractive woman in any room she'd entered. They stopped when they saw Nora. The older woman's gaze moved to her with the deliberate assessment of someone who had already heard a story and was now comparing the subject to the version she'd been told. Eli Hart, she said, her eyes not leaving Nora. I heard you had company. Mrs. Alcott, Miss Alcott. Eli had turned from the counter. His voice was courteous, but nothing warmer than that. And this must be her. Mrs. Alcott looked Nora up and down. The look was practiced, the kind that managed to express judgment without committing to any specific statement about it. The mail-order bride who didn't quite work out. The words landed like a small stone thrown at glass, not enough to break it, but enough to make it ring. Nora felt the heat rise in her chest. She let it rise without showing it. Nora Calloway, she said, and you've heard a partial story, Mrs. Alcott. I've heard what I've heard, dear. Then you've heard Dorian Voss's version, which is the version of a man who sent a woman into a December blizzard with $20 and called it a settlement. The younger woman, Carolyn Alcott, Nora would learn, stepped forward. Her smile was the thin, precise kind that carried a blade inside it. It must have been difficult, she said, with the specific sympathy that was designed to wound rather than comfort. Being rejected like that, publicly. Nora looked at her directly. It was difficult being sent out to die. The rejection I survived, without much trouble. Carolyn's smile flickered. Still, she said, recovering, living with an unmarried man without proper arrangement, people will talk. I imagine you understand that. People are already talking, Nora said. I'm here so they can do it with accurate information instead of whatever they've been given. She held Caroline's gaze. You're welcome to draw your own conclusions. Most people prefer to. Mrs. Alcott drew herself up. You have a sharp tongue for someone dependent on another's charity. I'm not dependent on charity. I'm working. Same as anyone. Nora's voice stayed even. It cost her something to keep it that way, but she paid the cost. And I'd be careful about repeating Mr. Voss's characterization of events, Mrs. Alcott. He sent a woman to die in a storm. That's not a story that gets better with retelling. The silence in the store was absolute. Tom had stopped pulling supplies and was watching with his arms at his sides. Eli had turned from the counter. Even the two men browsing near the back wall had gone still. Mrs. Alcott's expression had gone rigid. Not angry exactly, more the specific rigidity of someone who hadn't expected to need to defend their position and had found themselves doing it anyway. Victor Voss is a respected member of this community, she said more quietly now. And I'm a woman who walked 15 miles through a blizzard because he decided I was disposable. Nora looked at her steadily. I'm not asking you to take my side, Mrs. Alcott. I'm just asking you to hear both sides before you choose one. A long moment. Then Mrs. Alcott turned to Tom, who had been watching all of this with the expression of a man taking careful inventory. I'll be back for my order this afternoon, Tom. She walked out. Carolyn followed, pausing at the door to look back at Nora with an expression that was more thoughtful than hostile, as though Nora had presented her with a problem she hadn't expected and wasn't sure yet how to solve. Then the door closed and the store exhaled. Tom moved back down the shelves and resumed filling Eli's order. After a moment, he said, without looking up, You handle yourself well. I've had practice, Nora said. Eli came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything, but she could feel the steadiness of him next to her, and it was not a small thing. As they were loading the wagon outside the smithy across the street, a broad, scarred man named Marcus Webb, who Eli had introduced her to briefly, came out of his forge and crossed to them. He was wiping his hands on a cloth and his expression was direct. "Heard what you said in there," he told Nora. "I didn't say it for an audience," she said. "No, that's why it worked." He looked at her, then at Eli. "She's right about Voss. He's been doing this for years, different name, different target, same pattern. Most people don't say it out loud because they owe him something." A pause. "I don't." Eli extended his hand and Marcus shook it. "You need anything," Marcus said. "You come find me first." They drove back through a sky that had begun to cloud over heavy and gray in the way that preceded snow. Nora watched the town recede behind them and thought about what had just happened, about the careful violence of Caroline Alcott's smile and the specific courage it had taken to stay level in the face of it. "You all right?" Eli asked. "Yes," she paused. "Do you think it helped going in?" "Tom will think about what you said." Marcus already believed it. "Mrs. Alcott will tell people what happened because she can't help herself, and some of those people will think about it too." He guided the horses around a frozen rut in the road. "You can't win the valley in a day, but you can plant seeds. And Voss? We'll hear about it by tomorrow morning." He glanced at her. "Which means we need to be ready for what comes next." "What does come next?" Eli was quiet for a moment. The horses moved steadily through the cold, their breath rising in clouds. "He'll escalate," he said. "Something bigger than cut fences and loosen plugs. He needs to reassert control, prove that the rules still apply, that there are consequences for not following them." "How do you know?" "Because that's what he did to me before." He said it simply without drama. Just a fact that had been sitting in him for 8 years, as certain and useful as a compass bearing. He escalates in stages. Inconvenience first, then intimidation, then damage. He paused. Then something he can't take back. The sky pressed down on the valley, heavy and white at the edges. "Then we'd better be ready," Nora said. "We will be." They were 3 days from the storm when the men came in the night. Eli woke to the sound of hoofbeats at midnight. 4 horses, maybe 5, coming up from the south trail at a pace that wasn't casual. He was at the window with the rifle before his eyes were fully adjusted to the dark. Nora appeared at the edge of the loft. "I hear them," she said. "Get dressed. Stay up there." "Eli, please." She disappeared. He heard her moving quickly. Outside, the riders stopped. A lantern swung somewhere in the dark. A voice he recognized, the young man from Voss's first visit, the one with the rifle barrel, called out, "Strand, come out." Eli put on his coat and stepped onto the porch with the rifle in his hands, barrel pointed at the ground. 4 men sat on horseback in his yard. The young one in front, 3 others behind him, whose faces he couldn't quite read in the lantern light. Hired hands, the specific kind that had stopped having names the moment they'd been paid enough. "What do you want?" Eli said. The young man, Eli would learn later, his name was Colt Driscoll, that he'd been with Voss's operation for 3 years, that he was 24, and didn't have whatever it took to walk away, leaned forward in the saddle. "Mr. Voss wants to be reasonable," he said. "He's willing to compensate you for your trouble. $500 for the woman's upkeep since she arrived. Call it even." A pause. "But she comes back with us tonight." "She's not going anywhere." Driscoll's expression didn't change. "Mr. Voss was very clear, Strand. We're not leaving without her." "And I'm very clear," Eli said. "You are." One of the men in the back shifted. His hand moved. "You pull that," Eli said without looking at the man. "You'd better be ready to use it. And you'd better be faster than I am, which you're not." The hand went still. "This doesn't need to go bad," Driscoll said. His voice had taken on an edge. Not anger, nervousness. He was young enough that he hadn't yet learned to hide it completely. "Just hand her over and we'll be gone. No trouble." "There's already trouble," Eli said. "You brought it when you rode up here at midnight. The question is, how much more you want to carry back with you." The silence stretched. The lantern swung. Snow began to fall from somewhere above them, just a few flakes silent and white disappearing against the dark ground. Then the cabin door opened behind him. Nora stepped out onto the porch. Eli didn't turn. He kept his eyes on the 4 men in the yard and felt her come to stand beside him. And in the specific quality of her presence, the steadiness of it, the refusal to be anywhere other than where she'd chosen to be, something settled in him. I heard, she said to the men in the yard, and the answer is no. Driscoll stared at her. Miss Calloway, he said. He sounded beneath the practiced hardness, almost apologetic. Almost. Mr. Voss just wants... Mr. Voss wants to erase me, she said. I know what that looks like. I've seen it before. She stepped forward to the edge of the porch. Tell him I'm not erasable. Tell him I've documented every incident of sabotage on this property with dates, descriptions, and a running account of damages. Tell him I've written to the territorial marshal, and I'll write again every time something new happens. She paused. Tell him I'm not afraid of him, and tell him that should worry him considerably. Driscoll looked at her for a long moment. His jaw tightened. He looked at Eli. Eli raised the rifle slightly. Not aimed, just raised. Driscoll pulled his reins. Without another word, he turned his horse and rode back down the trail. The other three followed their lanterns, bobbing and fading into the dark. When they were gone, Nora let out a breath that she'd been holding for what sounded like the entire conversation. You were supposed to stay upstairs, Eli said. I know. She didn't sound apologetic about it. He looked at her. She looked back at him. In the dark and the cold, with snowflakes just beginning to fall around them, her face was composed and certain in a way that had nothing to do with bravado and everything to do with a decision she'd clearly made and was not revisiting. Come inside, he said. It's cold. They went in. He bolted the door. She sat at the table and he poured coffee, and for a while neither of them spoke. The stove ticked and popped. Outside, the snow began to fall in earnest. He's going to escalate, she said finally. Yes. You said damage comes next. What kind of damage? Eli sat down across from her. He looked at the coffee in his cup, then at her. Something that makes staying harder than leaving her, he said. Something that costs more to fix than most people would pay. He set the cup down. The goal isn't to beat us in a fight. It's to make us decide the fight isn't worth having. Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I found something in the advertisement. She rose, went to the coat hanging by the door, and came back with a folded piece of paper. She set it on the table between them. Eli picked it up. Read it? It was the original advertisement, the one she'd answered back in Pittsburgh. He read it twice, then looked at her. I read it 100 times on the train, she said, looking for what I was getting into. What kind of man? She reached across the table and pointed to the signature at the bottom of the page. I wrote to that name. I made all my arrangements through that name. The marriage brokers, the contract, the passage, all of it was arranged under that name. The name at the bottom of the advertisement was not Dorian Voss. It was D.C. Voss. D.C., Eli said slowly. Dorian's legal name is Dorian Cullen Voss. I didn't know that when I answered. I found out in town today. Tom mentioned it, said Voss had been using his initials on correspondence for years because he didn't like his middle name. She tapped the paper. The marriage contract I signed it is made out to D.C. Voss, not Dorian Voss, not the same legal name. Eli looked at her, which means she said that depending on how a lawyer reads it, I may not have ever entered into a legally binding arrangement with Dorian Voss at all. I may have contracted with a name that doesn't correspond to a recognized legal person. The silence between them was different from the silences they usually kept. Where did you learn to think like that? Eli said. From 6 years of watching mill owners find reasons that our labor agreements didn't mean what we thought they meant. Her expression was dry but not bitter. You learn the rules by watching them be broken. Eli folded the advertisement carefully and slid it back to her. You need to write to a lawyer, he said, not just the marshal, someone in Cheyenne who handles contract law. I already have the letter drafted. She tucked the paper back into her coat. I just needed someone to tell me I wasn't imagining it. You're not imagining it. She nodded once. Then she looked at him. Really looked at him with the full force of those dark, attentive eyes and said, You've been carrying what Voss did to you for 8 years. It wasn't a question. Eli didn't answer immediately. He looked at the stove, at the coffee, at the worn wood of the table that he'd built himself, from boards he'd cut himself, from trees he'd felled himself, because after losing everything, once he'd wanted to own every nail in his life. I've been managing it, he said. There's a difference. Is there? He looked up. I think you came north and built this place and made yourself into someone who didn't need anything, she said, not unkindly. And I think that worked until I knocked on your door. A long silence. Maybe, he said. I'm not asking you to stop managing it, she said. She paused. I just want you to know that you don't have to. Not with me. He looked at her across the table in the firelight, this woman who had walked out of a blizzard and into his life, and who saw things that he'd spent years making invisible, and felt something shift in his chest, something that had been holding itself shut for so long that the movement of it was almost painful. All right, he said. She nodded. And that apparently was enough. Outside, the snow fell in earnest now, blanketing the yard and the barn and the trail south where 4 riders had disappeared into the dark. The valley was quiet, the stars were hidden, but in the cabin the fire burned steady and the coffee stayed warm, and 2 people who had spent too long being alone with their particular kinds of damage were slowly, carefully learning to share the weight of it. Neither of them spoke about the feeling that was building between them, the warmth that had nothing to do with the stove, the specific gravity that made a room feel different when both of them were in it. They were both too careful for that, too accustomed to the cost of hope extended before it was ready, but they felt it. And 3 days later, when the fence was cut again and the cattle were scattered across country that didn't want to give them back, they rode out together in the cold without discussion and worked until after dark and came home tired and snow-covered and sat by the fire with aching shoulders and the quiet satisfaction of people who had faced something together and not found the other person wanting. And that night when Nora climbed up to the loft and Eli banked the fire below, the sound of the wind outside felt less like threat and more like witness. Something was being built here, something neither of them had planned. And Dorian Voss, 8 miles south in his warm study, was about to do something that would either destroy it or forge it into something that couldn't be broken. He hadn't decided which outcome he was planning for. That, in the end, would be his most expensive mistake. It was a Sunday evening when Nora first understood the full weight of what she'd walked into. She'd been thinking about the land. Not Eli's land, though she'd come to feel something for these 200 acres that surprised her with its intensity, the way the ridge turned gold at sunset and the creek ran quick and cold beneath the ice in winter, and the smell of pine and frozen earth that had become, without her realizing it, the smell of something like home. She'd been thinking about her land. She had no land. She'd come west with a canvas bag and a dress and her mother's watch. The idea of owning land, of having her name on a deed anywhere, was so distant from her experience that she wouldn't have known how to reach for it. And yet, the advertisement. She'd read it so many times that she had it memorized the way you memorize something that you sensed mattered more than you understood. Rancher seeks respectable woman for partnership and home. References provided. Passage arranged. She'd assumed passage meant the train ticket. She'd assumed partnership meant the work of building a shared life. But what if it meant something else? She sat at the table after dinner while Eli oiled a harness by the stove, and she turned the pages of the small journal she'd kept since Pittsburgh, a habit from the mill, where she'd learned that writing things down was the only way to hold on to them. She paged back through her entries from the journey west, looking for something she'd half noticed and then let go. She found it on the page from the first day at Voss's property. He showed me the east field this morning from the window, said it was good grazing land, good water access, said it would need managing, asked me twice if I had relatives out west or anyone who might come looking. I thought it was a strange question for a man who was supposedly considering me for a wife. I see now it might not have been about me at all. She read it twice. Then she read it a third time. Eli. He looked up from the harness. What do you know about the wind east of the Voss property down toward the fork in the Calloway Creek? A beat of silence. Why do you ask? Because Voss asked me on my first day there whether I had family out west, whether anyone would come looking. She set the journal down flat on the table. And because the creek is called Calloway Creek. Eli was very still. He set the harness down slowly, the way you set down something fragile when you've just realized it's more fragile than you thought. Then he crossed to the table and sat down across from her. There's a land patent, he said. Old one filed about 20 years ago by a man named Charles Calloway. He worked a placer claim up on the Absaroka before it played out, then took a homestead grant on the East Bench. Good land. Better than good, that section runs right along the primary watershed for the whole Middle Valley. He paused. He died about 12 years ago. No wife, the record shows. But he had a daughter back east. Nora's hands went flat on the table. A daughter he'd mentioned in his will, Eli continued. I know because I looked at land records when I first came north trying to understand who owned what. The Calloway grant never transferred. It's been sitting in limbo for years because the heir, whoever she is, never came to claim it. The fire popped. My father, Nora said, was named Charles Calloway. He went west before I was born. My mother told me he died, that there was nothing to go back to, that it was better not to think about it. Her voice was entirely steady. It was the steadiness of someone keeping a very tight grip. She died when I was 16. I found letters after letters from a lawyer in Cheyenne asking about an heir for a land claim. I didn't understand what they meant. I was 16 and working in a mill, and I didn't know what a land patent was or how to answer a legal letter. I threw them away. She looked at Eli. The advertisement, she said. Dorian Voss didn't want a wife. He wanted the heir. The silence in the cabin was enormous. He knew your name, Eli said slowly. Knew your mother's name, probably. Knew there was an heir out there somewhere. He found you through the marriage broker, or found your name through records and arranged for the broker to find you. He looked at the journal on the table. If you'd married him, any property you inherited would have transferred to him under territorial law. The Calloway grant would have been his. And when I arrived and he saw me, he saw a woman who might figure it out. Eli's jaw was tight. Someone observant, someone who asked questions, someone who wasn't going to sign over her rights without understanding what she was signing. So he sent me away. Before you had a chance to understand what you had. Nora sat back in her chair. She looked at the ceiling of the cabin, the rough-hewn beams, the lamp hook, the familiar geometry of the place that had become against all odds, and in a very short time the place she felt safest. My father's land, she said. Your land, Eli said. I don't have papers. I don't have the original patent documents. I don't even know what the claim number is. But you know the name, and you know the law, apparently. He looked at her steadily. Land patents are public record in the territorial office in Cheyenne. The original filing would have your father's name. The will, if there is one, would name you. If I can claim it. When you claim it, she looked at him. That land controls the primary water source for the entire Middle Valley, he said quietly. That's why Voss wants it. Not for the cattle range, for the water rights. Whoever holds that land controls what everyone downstream gets. Farmers, ranchers, the town itself. He paused. That's the leverage. That's what he's been building toward. Nora was quiet for a long time. Then she said, he's not going to let me live long enough to claim it. No, Eli said, he's not. The words sat between them without softening. Eli didn't reach for a kinder version of it. That was one of the things she'd come to trust about him. He didn't make hard things softer when softening them would be a form of disrespect. Then we need to move faster than he does, she said. Yes. The letter to the lawyer in Cheyenne. I need to send it this week. I'll write in Monday morning, post it myself. And I need to write to the Territorial Land Office. Ask for a copy of the Calloway patent and any associated documents. I know a man in Cheyenne who handled my land sale, the original one before Voss took the Sweetwater property. He's honest, and he knows territorial law. Eli stood and crossed to the desk in the corner of the cabin, pulling a drawer open. He found a scrap of paper, wrote a name and an address in his careful spare handwriting, and set it in front of her. Write to him directly. Tell him everything. Tell him I sent you. Nora looked at the name on the paper. Franklin Ames, she read. He'll know what to do. She looked up at him. In the firelight, his face was serious and certain, the face of a man who had been waiting without knowing it for something worth directing all that steady determination toward. You could have told me this earlier, she said, about the land when you first put it together. I put it together tonight, he said. Same as you. She considered that, decided it was true. All right, she said. She picked up the pen. And that night, by firelight, while the snow fell outside and the horses stirred in the barn and the valley settled into its deep winter silence, Nora Calloway wrote the letter that would change everything, her precise, clear handwriting moving across the page with the focused intensity of someone who had finally understood what they were fighting for and why it was worth the cost. She wrote for 2 hours. When she was done, she folded the letter, sealed it, and set it on the corner of the table where Eli would pick it up in the morning. Then she climbed to the loft and lay in the dark and felt for the first time since she'd stepped off the train in Wyoming something that wasn't merely survival. It was the beginning of something she could name. And downstairs, Eli banked the fire and lay down on his bedroll and stared at the ceiling and thought about water rights and inherited land and the specific expression on Nora Calloway's face when she'd understood what her father had left her. And he thought about the fact that protecting her had become somewhere in the past weeks no longer separate from protecting everything else he'd built here. He didn't examine that too closely. Not yet. But he held it the way you hold something true when you're not quite ready to speak it aloud. Outside, the snow kept falling, and the valley kept its counsel, and Dorian Voss sat in his study with a fire dying in the grate and the unpleasant sense that something had changed in the air, some balance he'd been maintaining for years, shifting slightly, like the first creak of ice in the first week of spring, a sound that meant nothing yet, but warned of everything that was coming. The letter went out on Monday. By Wednesday, the water trough had been overturned, not just unplugged this time, but knocked completely off its stone base and left face down in the mud. It would take 2 men most of a morning to right it and reseal it against the cold. 2 tool handles had been snapped clean through the breaks, deliberate, the wood splintered in the specific way that required force and intent. And one of the gate latches on the south pasture had been worked loose enough that 4 horses had wandered out in the night, requiring Eli to spend the pre-dawn hours tracking them across snow-covered terrain in temperatures that hovered at zero. Each incident taken alone could have been explained away. Together they formed a pattern so clear it would have been insulting if Voss hadn't clearly assumed they were too worn down to notice. They noticed. "He's changing pace," Eli said on Wednesday evening. He was at the stove, warming in his hands after 2 hours in the dark tracking horses. "It's faster now, more frequent. He knows about the letter." Nora was at the table writing another one, a detailed account of each incident with dates and descriptions. She'd been keeping the record since the first fence cut. It was 11 pages now. "Or he suspects we've found something. Either way, he's trying to exhaust us before we can act on it. He underestimates how hard you are to exhaust." She glanced up. Something in her expression softened for just a moment before she looked back down at the page. "He underestimates both of us," she said. Eli sat down across from her and watched her write. Her handwriting was small and precise, each letter formed with the careful completeness of someone who had grown up understanding that words on paper were the only form of power available to people who had no other kind. She wrote without hesitation, without crossing things out. She composed in her head first and committed to the page when she was certain. "Tom came by while you were out after the horses," she said without looking up. Eli stilled slightly. "What did he say?" "He said people in town are talking." She set the pen down and looked at him. "He said Mrs. Alcott has been telling people that you've lost your judgment, that I'm the reason your property is in trouble." She paused. "He also said that Voss offered to pay off his supply debt last week. 20% reduction if Tom stops doing business with you." Eli was quiet. "He told you this," he said. "He came to tell me himself. I thought about that afterward, the fact that he came to me, not to you. I think he was trying to warn me." She folded her hands on the table. "I think he's still deciding which side to come down on. Tom's a fair man. Tom's a man with a family and a business and a powerful neighbor who's offering him an easy way out," Nora said, not cruelly, just clearly. "Fair men still have to eat." Eli looked at her. The fire crackled. The wind moved outside, low and constant. "What would you do?" he asked. "In his position." She considered it seriously the way she considered everything. "I'd like to think I do the right thing," she said. "But I know I spent 6 years in a mill watching women do the wrong thing because the right thing costs too much. I don't judge Tom for what he's facing. I just don't count on him until we know which way he falls." Eli nodded, a small nod, the kind that acknowledged something true. "You're wise," he said. "I'm experienced," she said. "It's not quite the same thing." They worked in silence for a while. Nora finished the incident log and started a separate letter, this one to Franklin Ames in Cheyenne, detailing the water rights situation and asking specific questions about the process for establishing an heir's claim to a land patent when the original holder had died intestate. She wrote carefully using the precise legal language she'd pieced together from Tom's conversations and from a law primer she'd found in the bottom of Eli's storage chest, apparently left by a previous owner of the property. Eli read the letter when she was done. He made 2 corrections, a date and a parcel number he knew from his own land research, and handed it back. "You know more about this than you should for someone who grew up in a mill," he said. "I know exactly as much as I needed to survive," she said. "In the mill, if you didn't understand your labor contract, you got cheated. If you didn't understand the company store, counting, you went into debt you could never repay. You learned the rules or the rules ate you." She sealed the envelope. "I was eaten once. I decided not to be eaten again." He looked at her with an expression she'd seen on him before, the one that appeared when she said something that required a moment to settle. Not surprise exactly, more like recognition. She noticed it, didn't say anything about it, but she felt it. The porch conversation happened on a Thursday evening when the temperature had climbed briefly to just above freezing, warm enough that the eaves dripped and the air smelled of wet pine and turned earth, the smell of winter releasing its grip by a fraction. Nora had stepped outside after dinner to feel it, the warmth. After weeks of brutal cold, even this marginal thaw felt like a gift. She was sitting on the porch steps watching the last light go out of the sky when Eli came out and sat beside her. He had 2 cups of coffee and handed her one without asking. They sat like that for a while, just the 2 of them on the steps in the cold, almost warm, watching the valley go dark. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You can ask me anything." She had been thinking about this for days. Not how to ask it, that was easy, but whether opening it would change something between them that was currently working. She decided to ask anyway. "The wife in Missouri," she said. "Do you still know it?" He said it simply. "We wrote for a year after she left. Then she remarried, a farmer from her hometown." A pause. "Good man from what I heard. She's happy. My son is 12 now. He writes sometimes." He looked at the sky. "I wrote back until he stopped writing. I don't know if that was his choice or hers." "I'm sorry. I'm not asking for that." He said it without hardness, just accuracy. "I made choices that led to where I am. So did she. Neither of us was entirely wrong, and neither of us was entirely right. And the honest version of the story is more complicated than the clean one." Nora thought about Funston. "The clean version is you were wronged by Voss," she said. "And the complicated version is I was too proud to ask for help until it was too late. I thought I could manage it myself, the debt, the drying creek, all of it. I didn't tell her how bad it was until the land was already gone." He wrapped his hands around the cup. "Voss gave me the reason to lose everything. I gave myself the means." She looked at him sideways. His profile against the darkening sky, the strong lines of it, the set of his jaw, the way he held himself with a stillness that she'd come to understand was not blankness, but a kind of careful presence. "That's a hard thing to carry," she said. "It's a useful thing to carry," he said. "Reminds me to ask for help when I need it." He looked at her. "You're better at that than I am, for what it's worth. At asking for help. At letting people see what you actually are, instead of the version that doesn't need anything." She was quiet for a moment. "I knocked on a stranger's door, half dead in a blizzard," she said. "That's not exactly projecting strength." "No, but you walked in and sat down and told me the truth about what had happened without trying to make it into something more acceptable. Most people don't do that." A pause. "Most people spend all their energy managing how they're perceived. You spend your energy on the actual situation." She thought about that. "It's because I don't have the surplus," she said. "Managing perceptions costs something. I spent everything I had just getting here. I didn't have anything left over for the management." "Maybe that's what strength looks like then. Not having a surplus." She turned to look at him fully. He was looking at the valley, not at her, and the firelight from inside the cabin came through the window behind them and caught the side of his face. "I've been thinking," she said carefully, "about what it would mean. If we win, if the land claim goes through, if the letter to the marshal results in something, if Voss is held accountable." She paused. "I'd have land, property, a reason to stay." "You have a reason to stay now." She held his gaze. "I know." The silence between them was different from all the silences they'd kept before. Those had been comfortable, workable, the silence of 2 people who understood each other's rhythms. This one had weight. It was the kind of silence that formed around something that hadn't been said yet, but was thinking about being said. Eli turned to look at her. Nora, he said, just her name. The way he said it had changed in recent weeks without either of them marking the change more carefully now, like something worth handling well. I know, she said again before he could say whatever he'd been going to say. I know what this is. I'm not asking you for anything. I just wanted you to know that when I think about what comes after you're in it. His expression was very still. You're in it too, he said. Whatever comes after. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she looked back at the valley. Okay, she said softly. Okay, he said. They sat on the porch for another half hour, not talking, watching the stars come out one by one over the mountains. The dripping from the eaves had slowed as the temperature dropped again. The brief thaw was already closing back up. But something had opened between them and stayed open. And when they went back and saw, the cabin felt different, warmer, in a way that had nothing to do with the stove. It was Tom Reeves who told them 3 days later what they had been missing. He came out to the ranch on a Friday afternoon, which was unusual enough that Eli met him at the fence line with a look that asked the question before he did. Tom dismounted and tied his horse and said without preamble, I've been thinking about what Miss Calloway said in the store and what I know about Voss, and I need to tell you something. They sat inside around the table. Nora made coffee. Tom took it with both hands and held it and said, I owe Voss money. Not a lot by his measure, a note he holds on the store expansion I did 4 years ago. He's been patient about it because patient was useful. Now he's called it in. He looked at Nora. He told me I could settle the debt by telling him what I know about your situation. What you've been planning, whether you're in contact with anyone in Cheyenne. A silence. What did you tell him? Eli said. Nothing yet. Tom set the cup down. I came here first. He looked between them. I need you to understand what it cost me to do that. I have a wife and 3 children, and if Voss decides to make life difficult for me, he has the means. I know, Eli said. I'm not asking for credit. I'm asking you to understand that this is real what I'm risking. Tom turned to Nora. I want to do the right thing. I just need it to be worth doing. What would make it worth doing? Nora asked. Proof, Tom said. Something concrete. Something I can point to if Voss comes after me. Something that makes it clear that standing with you is better for the valley than standing with him. Nora looked at Eli. Then she reached into her coat and laid 3 things on the table. The advertisement with the D.C. Voss signature. The contract she'd been given also signed D.C. Voss. In a letter which she'd received that morning, a fast reply from Franklin Ames in Cheyenne that confirmed the Calloway land patent was still active and uncontested, that the registered heir was listed as daughter name unknown, and that any surviving legitimate heir could file a claim within 6 months. Tom read each document. He was a slow reader, thorough. When he was done, he set them down and looked at the ceiling for a moment. The land, he said, controls the primary watershed for the entire Middle Valley, Eli said. He doesn't want to run her off because she embarrassed him. He wants to run her off before she figures out what she has. Tom was quiet. He's been buying up land along that creek for 3 years, he said finally. Small parcels, quietly. I wondered what he was building toward. He looked at the documents. Now I know. Will you help us? Nora asked. Tom looked at her for a long moment. I'll do what I know, he said. I'll tell people what the documents say. I'll stand witness if it comes to that. But Nora, he said her name like he'd earned the right to, which perhaps he had. If Voss does what I think he's capable of, statements and letters won't be enough. He'll go after the ranch directly. We know, she said. You need to be ready. We are. He looked at Eli then with the specific look of men who had known each other long enough to skip past the surface of things. She's something, Tom said. I know, Eli said. Tom finished his coffee, said he'd be in touch, and rode back down the trail toward town. That night after dinner, Eli reinforced the cabin door with an extra crossbar. He checked every window latch, loaded both the rifle and the shotgun, and showed Nora without drama methodically how to use each one. Where to position herself if men came, when to hold ground, and when to move. She listened with the focused attention she gave to everything worth learning. You're not afraid, he said, watching her run her hands over the rifle stock. I'm afraid, she said. I just know that the fear is information, not instruction. She looked up at him. You told me that. I did. You were right." He looked at her holding the rifle in the firelight and felt something move in his chest, the same thing he'd felt on the porch, the thing that had been accumulating since the night she'd walked in out of the blizzard and hadn't stopped accumulating since. "Whatever he sends," he said, "we handle it together." "Together," she said. The barn burned on a Tuesday. Eli woke to the smell of smoke and was on his feet before his eyes adjusted. The cabin was dark except for embers in the stove. But the smell was wrong, sharp, acrid, coming from outside with a heat underneath it that wasn't natural. "Nora," his voice was level, controlled. "Get up now." She appeared at the loft edge, already moving. She'd been sleeping lighter these past weeks. They both had. "I smell it," she said. "Dress, fast." He grabbed his boots. His coat yanked the door open. The barn was a wall of orange. Fire had taken hold across the entire south face, feeding on dry timber and old hay, climbing toward the roof in sheets of red and gold that lit the yard like a false dawn. The smoke was a living thing, thick and black, rolling out above the flames and spreading across the snow. The heat hit him at 50 feet. His eyes were streaming before he reached 30. The horses were screaming. He ran. Nora was right behind him, shouting something he couldn't hear over the roar. He hit the barn doors with his shoulder, threw them open, and was swallowed by smoke. Inside was chaos. The horses were in their stalls, wild-eyed, throwing themselves against the wood. The cattle in the back pen were bellowing, crammed together near the far wall. The fire had started in the southeast corner and was moving fast, the dry timber catching almost as fast as the hay. "The cattle, get them out," he yelled. Nora didn't answer. She was already at the pen gate, working the latch with both hands. Eli went for the horses. The bay came hard. She reared as soon as he touched her halter, 20 feet of terrified animal moving in all the wrong directions. He held on and pulled, talking to her in the low, steady voice that was all he had left. And she fought him every step until they hit the open door and the cold air outside hit her face and she bolted into the dark. He turned back before she cleared the fence. The smoke was worse now. He could see the ceiling above him beginning to glow, the heat traveling up the walls, finding the rafters. Part of the roof would go in minutes. The gelding came easier. Then the old mare. The young stallion fought him hard, took a chunk out of his coat before he got a rope on him, but came. 4 horses. 2 more. He went deeper. The fire was on 3 sides now. The roaring was enormous, the kind of sound that took up all the available space in your head and left no room for anything else. His lungs were seizing. His eyes had stopped working clearly, just shapes in the smoke, the pale shape of a horse against a dark stall. He found the 5th hind down. She'd been overcome by the smoke, lying on her side in the stall, still breathing, but only just. He dropped to his knees, grabbed the halter, hauled. She was dead weight. He hauled again, harder, and she stirred, and he got under her shoulder and pushed as she struggled upright, and somehow they made it to the door and into the cold air together before the section of roof above her stall came down with a sound like a cannon. Eli released her and turned back. "Eli," Nora's voice from somewhere to his left. She gotten the cattle out. He could hear them in the yard lowing and panicked, their hooves loud on the frozen ground. "Eli, you can't." "One more," he said, and went back in. He shouldn't have. He knew it when he did it. The last horse was the furthest back in the corner stall where the fire had started, and the walls around that stall were already burning, the wood glowing orange and beginning to buckle. The smoke was complete. He moved by memory 8 years of this barn, every post and beam in it, every latch and gap and corner. He found the horse by sound. It was still standing, still screaming, its hooves hammering at the stall boards. He got the gate open, got his hand on the halter, and the horse reared. Its front hoof caught him across the shoulder, not a full strike, but glancing enough to spin him into the wall. He hit the burning wood. He felt it before he registered what it was, a flare of heat, then impact, then nothing for a second, then everything at once. He was on the ground. The horse was gone, had bolted over him or around him in the dark. The ceiling above him was fully engaged now, the fire eating through the beams with a sound like distant explosions. Then hands were on him, pulling. Nora. She had both hands under his arms, and she was pulling him backward with everything she had, which was more than he'd expected, and exactly enough. He got his legs under him. She didn't let go. They moved together, him half-conscious and her completely certain, and they came through the barn doors at a run and fell into the snow 20 feet out. Behind them, the barn gave up. The roof came down all at once, the beams going first, then the walls folding inward, the whole structure collapsing in on itself with a roar that shook the ground and sent sparks spiraling up into the cold black sky. The fire burned white and orange at its heart, and the smoke rolled out in every direction, and the horses in the yard and the cattle beyond the fence were silent for one long moment, as if paying witness. Then Nora's hands were on his face. "Look at me," she said. "Eli, look at me." He looked at her. Her face was black with soot streaked where the heat had made her eyes run. Her hair had come half down, and there were burn marks on the sleeve of his coat where she grabbed him. "I'm all right," he said. "You're not all right. Your shoulder, it's not broken." He could feel it bruised badly, maybe cracked, but moving. "I'm all right, Amat." She didn't look convinced. But she sat back on her heels in the snow and looked at what was left of the barn, the burning skeleton of it, the light of the fire illuminating the whole yard and shifting orange and red, and he watched her expression move through grief and fury and something harder than both and settle somewhere that was all determination. Then he saw them, 4 riders on the ridge above the property, silhouetted against the fire glow, just watching. One of them, even from this distance in the dark, he could make out the particular posture of a man on an expensive horse, raised a hand in a slow, deliberate gesture. Not a wave. Something else. Something that said I did this. And I could do more. Then they turned and rode into the darkness. Nora had seen them too. She stood in the snow with her hands hanging at her sides and watched them go. And when they disappeared, she turned to Eli with an expression that was not quite grief and not quite anger. "He wasn't trying to scare us," she said quietly. "No, he was trying to end it." Eli stood. His shoulders screamed. He ignored it. "He didn't," he said. She looked at him. "He burned the barn," Eli said. "He didn't burn us." He held her gaze across the dying light of the fire. "That's the difference, and in the morning, that's what we're going to make sure everyone knows." Nora looked at the ruins for a long moment. Then she said quietly, with the specific certainty of someone who has passed through the worst thing and found themselves still standing on the other side, "Then let's make sure they hear it." By dawn, half the valley had arrived. Tom Reeves came first, riding hard from town, drawn by the glow in the sky that he'd seen from his bedroom window. Marcus Webb came 20 minutes later, still wearing his forge apron over his coat, his scarred hands carrying a lamp that was unnecessary now the fire had burned itself down to a glowing skeleton of timbers by the time he arrived. 3 other ranchers from the east and north of the valley came in ones and twos, men Eli knew by name, and by the handshake of fence-line neighbors who'd never been required to be more than that. They stood in the yard looking at the ruins. No one spoke for a long time. It was Marcus who broke the silence. He walked to the barn's foundation, just the stone base and the blackened earth now, and crouched down looking at something. Then he stood and turned to Eli. "Kerosene," he said. "You can smell it under the burn. Fire doesn't start that hot in the corner by itself." He looked at the ground near what had been the south wall. "Someone was here before you woke up." "I know," Eli said. Tom had come to stand beside him. His face was grim and unreadable in the cold morning light. He looked at Eli's shoulder the way Eli was holding his arm, the care in his movements that tried to pass for normalcy. "You went back in," Tom said. "Got them all out." "Not quite." A small pause. "Margaret Sutton's boy saw one of your horses dead along the east fence line when he came up the trail. Probably the smoke." Eli absorbed that. He didn't show it on his face, but Nora, standing beside him, felt him absorb it. "Voss sent men," Eli said to the assembled ranchers. He said it plainly without theater. 4 riders on the ridge when it was burning. I recognized one of them, Colt Driscoll, who works Voss's operation. They watched it burn and then rode back south. "That's not proof," said Samuel Garrett. He was a thin, careful man, not unkind but constitutionally cautious. He owned 2 sections north of Eli's land and had a family to feed and debts of his own. Riders on a ridge could be anyone. "It could," Eli said. "You're right about that." "Then why are you so certain?" "Because he's been working toward this for 3 weeks, Nora said. She had stepped forward from beside Eli. She was still soot-darkened, her coat carrying the smell of smoke, her hair loose. She looked nothing like someone making a polished argument and everything like someone telling the truth. "He's been cutting fences and damaging equipment and sending men to our door in the night," she said. "This is the escalation of a pattern. And the reason for the pattern is this." She reached into her coat and took out the documents, now slightly smoky from the night's events, but intact because she'd had the presence of mind to pocket them when she came down from the loft. Dorian Voss lured me west under a false arrangement because I am the legal heir to a land patent that controls the primary watershed for this entire valley. When he realized I might figure that out, he tried to send me into a blizzard to die. When that didn't work, he escalated. Last night was what escalation looks like when a man is out of patience and out of options. She held out the documents. "Read them," she said. "All of you, and then ask yourselves if Voss gets that land, if the heir disappears and the claim lapses. What happens to every farm and ranch that draws water from the Calloway Fork?" The ranchers looked at each other. There was a particular quality to the silence that followed, not disbelief, but the specific discomfort of people recognizing something they had half known and chosen not to examine. Samuel Garrett reached out and took the documents. He read them slowly, passed them to the man beside him. That man read them and passed them on. Marcus had come back to stand near Eli. He spoke quietly. "I'll ask around town. See who saw riders last night. There'll be someone." Tom, who had been standing slightly apart, said also quietly, but with a finality that had the weight of a decision made and not revisited, "I'll go with you." Eli looked at him. Tom met his gaze. "I told Voss I hadn't decided," he said. "I've decided." Something in Eli's expression moved. Not dramatically, he wasn't a man for dramatic expressions, but it moved. "Thank you, Tom," he said. "Don't thank me yet. I still need to go home and tell my wife." Tom's mouth bent into something that wasn't quite a smile. "That's the harder conversation." The group dispersed gradually. Some offered lumber for rebuilding. One rancher, a man named Fowler, who Eli had helped dig out after a bad storm 2 winters ago, said he could spare 2 hands for a week. Samuel Garrett, having finished reading the documents, handed them back to Nora with an expression that had shifted from cautious to something more like troubled. "I owe Voss on a grazing contract," he said. "If he controls the fork water, I'm finished." "So are most people in this valley," Nora said. He looked at her for a long moment. "What do you need? Witnesses," she said. "In time." "How much time?" "I don't know. Enough for the marshal to respond. Enough for a lawyer in Cheyenne to file the proper documents." Samuel was quiet. Then he nodded once with the deliberate gravity of a man who understood what he was committing to. When the last rancher had ridden out, Eli and Nora stood alone in the yard in the cold morning light. The ruins of the barns smoked quietly behind them. The surviving horses stood in a group near the fence, calmer now, occasionally nosing at the snow. The cattle had been driven back into the south pasture by Marcus and Tom before they'd left. Nora looked at everything that had been taken from them in a single night. Then she turned to look at Eli. His shoulder was bad. She could see it in the set of his jaw, the way he held his right arm slightly away from his body. He would not complain about it, and she knew better than to ask directly. "Come inside," she said. "Let me look at that." "It's fine." "Eli." He looked at her. She looked back at him with the expression she'd developed over weeks, the one that was patient and steady, and had just enough iron in it to let him know that the argument was already over. He went inside. She had him sit at the table, and she took off his coat with careful hands, then his shirt, and she examined the shoulder with the same methodical attention she gave to horses with swollen fetlocks and fence posts set at uncertain angles. It was badly bruised across the cap, and she could feel when she pressed along the joint the catch and reluctance that meant something had been pulled or strained, but not broken. "Not broken," she said. "I know. It will be stiff for a week. 2 if you're stubborn about it." "3 then," he said dryly, and she made a sound that might have been a laugh. She wrapped it with the linen she found in the medical box tight enough to support, loose enough to let him move, and he sat still for it with a patience that she suspected he had not always possessed. "You went back in for the last horse," she said. Her voice was neutral. She kept her eyes on the bandage. "Yes." Even though, yes, she tied off the bandage and sat back. She looked at him directly. "I thought," she stopped, started again. "When the roof came down and you didn't come out." "I came out," he said. "You came out because I pulled you out." "Yes," he said, quietly. "You did." The silence between them was different from all the silences they'd kept before. It had a different quality, heavier, more conscious of itself. like a room where something had been broken and everyone was waiting for someone to acknowledge the shape of the pieces. "I need you to not do that again," she said. Her voice was still level, still even. But the effort it cost was visible now, or at least visible to him because he'd been watching her for weeks. "I'll do my best," he said. "That's not good enough." He looked at her. "I need you here," she said. "One heroically dead in a burning barn. Here. That matters more than a horse." She held his gaze. "Do you understand what I'm saying?" He was very still. "I understand," he said. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she looked down at her hands, soot-stained, scraped, carrying the specific record of the night's events. "Good," she said softly. And then, because she had been holding herself together through the fire and the flight and the dawn gathering and the morning's work on his shoulder, and because this was the first quiet moment and the quiet had let the feeling back in her face, did something that it very rarely did. It cracked slightly. Just for a moment. Just a brief, unguarded break in the composure she'd built so carefully over so many years. Eli reached across the table and took her hand, not pulling her toward him, not performing comfort, just placing his hand over hers the way you place a hand on a fence post to feel whether it's solid. She looked at their hands on the table, his weathered and calloused and large, hers small and scratched and equally calloused now. "We're all right," he said. "I know," she said. "We're going to stay all right." "I know." She turned her hand over under his and held on. They sat like that for a while in the quiet of the cabin with the smell of smoke still in their hair, and the morning light coming through the window and the ruins of the barn visible beyond it, and outside, a hawk cried once from somewhere on the ridge, sharp and clear and carrying. They spent the next 2 days in methodical preparation. Eli cleared the barn site, sorting through what could be salvaged from the ash. Nora wrote. She wrote to the marshal again with a detailed account of the fire and the witnesses who had seen riders on the ridge. She wrote to Franklin Ames asking him to expedite the land claim filing. She wrote a careful, precise account of every incident of sabotage since Voss's first visit, with dates and descriptions and the names of anyone who could corroborate. 11 pages. She rewrote it twice to make it cleaner and handed the final version to Eli to read. He read it at the table after dinner and said nothing for a long time when he finished. "It's good," he said finally. "It's true," she said, "which I think is better. Same thing out here." He set the pages down. "When the marshal gets this combined with the land claim documents, he'll have to respond. Even if Voss has connections in Cheyenne, responding to something this documented costs him less than ignoring it. And if the marshal ignores it, then we go over his head, territorial governor's office." He met her eyes. "There's always a higher authority, Nora. The trick is making enough noise that reaching it becomes easier than silencing you." She looked at him steadily. "You've been thinking about this for a long time," she said. "Since the Sweetwater." A pause. "I spent 8 years wishing I'd made more noise. Gone higher, pushed harder, refused to let the quiet version of losing be the only version." He looked at the papers on the table. "You gave me a reason to try the louder version." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Dorian Voss burned our barn because he thought it would break us." "Yes." "It didn't." "No." She looked at the papers, at the window, at the man across the table from her who had become, over the course of a winter, something she hadn't expected and couldn't now imagine being without. "Then tomorrow," she said, "we go into town. We find Tom and Marcus and whoever else is willing, and we start making noise." Eli nodded. "Tomorrow," he said. Outside, the wind came down from the ridge with the sold in the smell of pine and the specific silence of a valley that was watching and waiting. Somewhere south of them, Dorian Voss was almost certainly making plans of his own. But he was making them under the assumption that two people who had lost everything would behave the way people who had lost everything usually behaved. He didn't know yet that those two people had found in losing everything something more durable than what they'd lost. He didn't know that was his real problem. He would find out. They rode into Blackwater Ridge the next morning under a sky the color of old iron. The tension was visible before they hitched the horses. People on the street stopped. Conversations paused. A woman coming out of the dry goods store looked at Nora with an expression that had changed from the calculating assessment of their first meeting. There was something different in it now. Uncertainty, maybe? Or the specific look of someone who has been repeating a story and has just been shown evidence that the story was wrong. Word of the fire had already reached town. That was the nature of a valley with no secrets. A fire large enough to light the ridge at midnight didn't stay private. By the time Eli and Nora walked through the door of the general store, every person in Blackwater Ridge knew that Eli Strand's barn had burned to the foundation and that he and the woman he'd taken in had barely made it out alive. What they didn't all know yet was what Nora intended to tell them. Tom was behind the counter when they entered, and the look he gave Eli was the look of a man who had been up early doing the thing he'd said he would do. "Marcus found two witnesses," Tom said before either of them had spoken. "Boy who works the Hargrove stable saw Driscoll and three others riding south on the main trail around midnight. Hargrove himself saw them come back just before dawn, horses lathered smelling of smoke." He reached under the counter and pulled out two sheets of paper covered in careful handwriting. "I wrote down what they said, signed and dated." Eli picked up the sheets, read them. "Good one," he said. "There's more." Tom lowered his voice slightly. "One of Voss's own men came to see me this morning. Early, before the store opened." He glanced at Nora. "His name is Anders Cole. He's been working Voss's operation for 2 years. He was on the ridge last night." Nora's chin came up. "He didn't set the fire," Tom continued quickly. "He was there, but he says he didn't know it was going to be arson. He thought it was going to be intimidation, show of force, scare hard off. When the fire started, he says Driscoll gave the order and the others did it before he could object." Tom looked at his hands for a moment. "He's scared. He came to me because he doesn't know who else to go to, and he knows if Voss finds out he talked, he's finished." "Where is he now?" Eli asked. "My storeroom, in the back." Anders Cole was younger than Nora had expected, mid-20s probably, with the specific look of someone who had made a series of small compromises over several years and had just arrived at the point where the compromises had become something he couldn't explain away. He was sitting on a crate when they came in, turning his hat in his hands. He looked up when Nora entered. Something in his expression shifted, guilt maybe, or the discomfort of seeing the person you'd helped hunt looking at you with clear, steady eyes. "Miss Calloway," he said. "Mr. Cole." She sat on a crate across from him. Eli stood by the door. "Tell me what you know," he told them. It took 20 minutes. He spoke in short, careful sentences, stopping sometimes to get the order of events right, sometimes to make clear what he'd seen directly and what he'd been told. He had a good memory and a precise way of describing things, which Nora suspected came from being the kind of man who had always known somewhere underneath that a day like this might come and he would need to account for himself. The key facts were these: Voss had known about Nora's identity, the Calloway heir, for more than a year before she'd answered the advertisement. He'd found her through a genealogy service he'd hired specifically to locate potential heirs to the Calloway patent. The marriage broker had been paid not to find Voss a wife, but to locate the heir and arrange a meeting under circumstances that would allow Voss to acquire her rights without her understanding what she was transferring. The arrangement had been designed to be executed quickly. Marry, document the union file, the rights transfer within the first 30 days before the woman had a chance to understand what she'd signed. "He'd done it before," Cole said. "Not here. Somewhere in the territories. I heard Driscoll talking about it once. A widow with a water claim east of Casper. Voss married her, the claim transferred, and 6 months later, she moved back east without understanding why the ranch had stopped working." Nora was very still. "How many people knew about this?" she asked. "Driscoll. A man named Garrett who handles the paperwork. Me now." He paused. "Voss keeps things in compartments. One person knows one part. Nobody knows all of it except him." "Except you know enough," Eli said. "I know enough," Cole agreed. He looked at Nora. "I'm sorry, Miss Calloway, for what that's worth." "It's worth something," she said. "Are you willing to put this in writing in front of witnesses?" "If I have protection." "We can't promise you protection," Eli said, "but we can promise you that if you testify truthfully, the record will show that you cooperated. That's worth more than protection from us. That's protection from the law." Cole thought about it. "All right," he said. Tom brought paper. Cole wrote. His handwriting was labored but legible, and when he was done, he signed his name at the bottom and handed the pages to Tom. Tom read them, then looked at Nora. "This is enough for the marshal," he said. "This, combined with your documentation and the witness statements about the fire, this isn't a civil matter anymore. This is criminal." "I know," Nora said. "There'll be pushback. Voss has people in Cheyenne." "Then we don't rely only on Cheyenne," she said. She looked at Eli. The governor's office. Franklin Ames said there's a territorial anti-corruption office that handles cases where local officials have conflicts of interest. You already wrote to them. Yeah, Eli said. It wasn't a question. Yesterday afternoon, she said, while you were clearing the barn site. Tom stared at her for a moment. Then he shook his head slowly with the expression of a man who has been underestimating someone and has finally understood the extent of his error. You planned for all of this, he said. I planned for the likelihood of all of this, she said. There's a difference. I hoped I was wrong. She paused. I wasn't. They held the meeting in the general store that afternoon. Tom had sent his son riding to every property within 10 miles, and by 2 o'clock the store was full. Ranchers, farmers, the smithy, the postmaster, 3 women whose husbands had died or were incapacitated and who ran their own operations with a competence that the valley largely pretended not to notice. Even Mrs. Alcott came, which surprised Nora until she saw the look on the older woman's face, not the calculating assessment of their first meeting, but something more troubled. Something that looked like someone reviewing a version of events they had accepted too quickly. Nora stood at the front of the room and told them everything. She told it the way she'd written the incident log, simply in order, without embellishment. She held up the documents, the advertisement and the contract, Franklin Ames's letter about the land patent, the incident record, Cole's signed statement. She passed them around the room and let people read for themselves. She described her father's land in terms the ranchers understood, the specific acreage, the creek frontage, the relationship between that watershed and every downstream property in the Middle Valley. She described what would happen if Voss acquired control of it. The room was very quiet. I'm not asking you to take my side against a neighbor, she said. I'm asking you to take your own side. Because if Dorian Voss controls the Calloway Fork, he controls your water, your cattle, your crops, your futures. She looked around the room at faces that were worried and calculating, and in some cases already frightened. He's been building toward this for years. He's been buying land, calling in debts, positioning himself. Last week he burned a barn. The week before that, he sent men here at night. The week before that, he was bribing a business owner to silence information. She paused. This valley is going to decide in the next few weeks whether that pattern continues or whether it stops here. I'd like it to stop here, but I need your help to do it. The silence held for a few more seconds. Then Marcus Webb said, "What do you need?" And Nora told them. The confrontation in the street happened 3 days later. Voss had clearly heard about the meeting. He rode into Blackwater Ridge on a Thursday morning with Driscoll at his side and 2 other men behind him. Fewer than he might have brought a month ago, Nora noticed. Fewer men willing perhaps now that Cole had talked and word had spread. They stopped their horses in front of the general store. Eli and Nora were already there, having been told by Tom's son that riders were coming up the South Trail. They stood on the boardwalk with Tom beside them and Marcus across the street in the doorway of his forge. Voss looked at the assembled group with the expression of a man recalibrating. "Strand," he said. "Miss Calloway." A pause. "I hear there's been some excitement." "You burned our barn," Eli said. His voice was flat and clear in the cold air. "That's a serious accusation." "We have a signed statement from Anders Cole," Nora said. "Who was on the ridge that night and who has provided a detailed account of the events, including your instructions to Driscoll, the kerosene, and the specific intent to ensure neither of us survived." Voss's jaw tightened. "Cole is a disgruntled employee. We have witness statements placing your men on the ridge. We have Cole's written account of the prior incidents of sabotage and the instructions he received. We have documentation of the pattern going back to your first visit to the property." She reached into her coat and held up the folder of papers. "And we have the full file which was sent to the Territorial Marshal's office on Monday and to the Governor's Anti-Corruption Office on Tuesday." Driscoll had gone pale. He was looking at Voss with an expression that had curdled from loyalty into something more complicated. Voss looked at the folder, then at Nora, then at the people who had assembled, the ranchers who'd come into town that morning, not by coincidence, who stood at various points along the street with the collective quiet of a community that had finally gotten clear about something. "You think a handful of letters is going to move a territorial official," he said. His voice was still controlled, still smooth. But underneath the smoothness, there was something Nora hadn't heard before, a faint edge of uncertainty, like the first crack in ice. I think a handful of letters combined with signed and witness statements and a confession from a direct participant will require the marshal to respond visibly, she said. In a visible response, any response to a filing that documents illegal activity against an heir to a legal land claim is going to attract attention from people with more reach than the marshal. She held his gaze. I think you've spent a decade operating in a small enough arena that the rules of that arena were the only rules that mattered. I think you may have miscalculated how small that arena actually is. Something moved across Voss's face. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the ranchers along the street, at Tom in the doorway, at Marcus, whose arms were crossed and whose expression said precisely nothing, but whose presence said a great deal. He looked at Driscoll, and in the look he gave Driscoll, flat assessing, coldly calculating, Nora saw something she hadn't expected. Not anger, not alarm, calculation. He was deciding whether Driscoll was salvageable or expendable. And Driscoll, who had clearly worked for Voss long enough to read that look, saw it too. "Mr. Voss," Driscoll said slowly. Voss didn't look at him, kept his eyes on Nora. "I could walk away," Voss said, "from all of it. The harassment charges, the fire, everything." He said it carefully, like he was laying out terms. "In exchange for you dropping the land claim." "No," Nora said. "The land isn't worth—" "The land is my father's," she said. "And it's mine. And it's this valley's." She stepped forward off the boardwalk to stand on the frozen mud of the street. "You can't buy me out, Mr. Voss. You couldn't when I arrived, and you can't now. I didn't come west to be bought. I came west to build something." She paused. "So did my father, apparently. He just died before he could." Voss stared at her. "You're going to lose everything," he said softly. "Whatever you think you've built with Strand, whatever this—" He gestured at the assembled ranchers. "Community support amounts to, I have resources you can't match. I have lawyers. I have relationships with officials you've never met. I can make this take years." "Then it takes years," she said. "I'll still be here." The silence stretched. Driscoll said quietly, "I'm not going back, Mr. Voss." Everyone looked at him. His face was pale but set. He'd made a decision somewhere in the last 60 seconds, and it had aged him visibly the way some decisions do. "I'm not going back to the property," he said. "I'll give my full statement to whoever asks. I'll testify to what I saw and what I was ordered to do." He looked at Nora. "I'm sorry, Miss Calloway. It should have stopped before it went where it went." Voss's face had gone very still. "Colt." "No, sir," Driscoll said. He pulled his horse back a step. "I signed on to work cattle." He turned and rode to the far end of the street where he tied his horse in front of the marshal's office, which had been, Nora noticed very carefully, placed in the most visible spot on the main road, and went inside. One of the other riders behind Voss looked at the marshal's office, then at Voss, then slowly turned his horse and rode in the same direction as Driscoll. The third followed. And Dorian Voss sat alone on his expensive black gelding in the main street of Blackwater Ridge and looked at two people who had nothing left to lose and had chosen to stand there anyway. And for the first time and as long as anyone watching could remember, he had the specific expression of a man who had run out of moves. "This is not over," he said. "It is in this street," Eli said. "Today." Voss looked at him, and in that look, brief, opaque, controlled, was the accumulated weight of a decade. The Sweetwater property. The dried creek, the family that had scattered. The 8 years in the mountains building something from nothing, not because it was comfortable, but because it was necessary. Eli didn't say any of that. He just held the look. Voss pulled his reins and rode south alone. The sound of his horse's hooves faded. The street was silent. Then Marcus Webb let out a long, slow breath. "Well," he said to no one in particular. Nora's legs were shaking. She became aware of this fact at the exact moment Eli stepped beside her, close enough that his arm was against hers, close enough that she could feel the steadiness of him. She stopped shaking. "Are you all right?" he said quietly. "Yes," she said. And then, because it was true and because some truths need saying even when they're simple, "Thank you." "You did most of that," he said. "We did most of it," she said. He looked at her sideways. In the cold morning light on the main street of Blackwater Ridge, with the ranchers beginning to move again around them, and Tom coming down from the boardwalk and Marcus crossing from the forge. Eli Strand looked at Nora Calloway with an expression that he usually kept internal and carefully managed, and for once didn't. She saw it. All of it. Everything he'd been holding while he'd been building and waiting and refusing to let the world's worst version of things be the final one. She reached up and touched his face, just her fingertips light and certain against his jaw. "We're not done yet," she said softly. "No," he said, "but we're closer." She nodded, dropped her hand. They turned together and walked back toward the store where Tom was holding the door and the ranchers were filing in out of the cold. And the work of the next chapter, the lawyers and the filings, in the long, careful process of holding a powerful man accountable, was waiting to begin. Outside, the hawk cried from the ridge again, sharp, defiant, carrying across the whole cold valley. The territorial marshal arrived on a Saturday. His name was Roy Calder. He was a compact, weathered man in his 50s, with a careful, systematic way of moving through a room that said he'd been doing this long enough to understand that the first version of any story was always incomplete. He read through Nora's documentation at Tom's table with the thoroughness of someone who had learned to respect paperwork, asking occasional questions that were brief and precise, dates, names, distances, the specific sequence of events. When he was done, he looked at Nora across the table. "You kept records from the beginning," he said. "I learned to keep records early," she said. "From working in a mill, the company always had records. Workers who didn't keep their own had no recourse." Calder considered that. "You're the heir to the Calloway patent. My attorney in Cheyenne is filing the formal claim this week, Franklin Ames." "I know Ames." A brief pause. "He's good." He looked at the Cole statement. "This man, Cole, he's willing to testify." "He is. He's been staying with Tom Reeves since Thursday." Calder turned to Tom. "You vouch for him?" Tom was quiet for a moment. "I vouch that he came forward of his own choice. What he did before that," he paused. "He was present at the fire. He didn't start it, but he was there. That's for the court." "Fair enough." Calder stood. He looked at Eli. "You know who I'm going to talk to next?" "Yes," Eli said. "Will it be a problem?" "Not from us." Calder took the documents, tucked them under his arm, and rode south toward Voss's property. He came back 3 hours later. He didn't speak to Eli or Nora directly, just stopped at Tom's store long enough to say that Voss had been formally notified of the investigation and instructed not to leave the territory. Then he rode north toward the telegraph office. The message he sent would bring 2 additional investigators from Cheyenne within the week. Tom told them that evening at the end of the day, when the store was empty and the 3 of them sat with coffee going cold in their cups. "He took it seriously," Tom said. "The Cole statement, the fire documentation, the land claim scheme that's fraud, conspiracy, possibly attempted murder." He looked at Eli. "Even men with connections in Cheyenne have to answer for attempted murder when there are enough witnesses." "Voss will fight it," Eli said. "He'll fight it in court, which is a different arena than burning barns at midnight." Tom set down his cup. "In court, Nora's paperwork is worth more than his connections." Nora said nothing. She was looking at the table, thinking about something she'd been thinking about since Calder's visit. "He did it before," she said. "Cole mentioned a widow in Casper, a water claim." Tom and Eli both looked at her. "If it worked once, there may be other cases," she said. "Other claims, other women who signed things they didn't understand and found themselves with nothing." She paused. "I told Calder about the Casper situation." He wrote it down. "You're trying to build a broader case," Eli said. "I'm trying to make sure that if Voss's lawyers find a way to narrow this to just the fire, there's still something left." She looked at him. "He can't buy his way out of a pattern. One incident is manageable. A documented pattern across multiple territories, that's different." Tom was looking at her with the expression she'd seen on him a few times now, the expression of a man reassessing his assumptions. "You were going to do all of this anyway," he said. "Before he burned the barn, you were already building the case." "I was building it in case I needed it," she said. "I hoped I wouldn't, but you were ready when you did." She shrugged slightly. "The mill taught me a lot of things. One of them was document everything before you need it, because after you need it, it's too late." The rebuilding took 3 weeks. It started the morning after Calder's visit When Fowler arrived with his two promised hands in a wagon full of pine lumber, and Marcus Webb rode out with his own tools and the easy authority of a man who had built and repaired things his entire life and knew exactly what needed doing. Samuel Garrett came on the third day with more lumber and his oldest son, who worked without being directed and asked good questions. Three other ranchers sent supplies, nails, roofing material, hardware delivered by hired hands, who arrived without ceremony and left the same way. The barn went up in stages. Eli and Marcus planned the framing. Fowler's men and the various volunteers who appeared on different days did the heavy work. Nora fed everyone not because it was assigned to her, but because feeding people who were working was useful, and because she was good at it, and because the act of making meals for people who were putting her home back together felt like something that mattered. On the fourth day, while they were raising the first wall section, Mrs. Alcott arrived. She came alone in a buggy without Caroline. She sat in the yard for a moment after she stopped the horse as though steeling herself, and then she got down and crossed to where Nora was carrying a tray of coffee out from the cabin. "Miss Calloway," she said. "Mrs. Alcott." Nora kept her voice neutral. "I owe you an apology." The older woman said it with the specific dignity of someone who was not accustomed to apologies and was making a genuine effort to do it correctly. "I repeated things I hadn't verified. I made assumptions about your character based on Voss's version of events, and I was wrong to do that." She paused. "I was also unkind. In the store that first day. That was wrong as well." Nora looked at her steadily. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. It wasn't an unfriendly question. It was a genuine one. Mrs. Alcott seemed to understand the distinction. "Because I've been telling other people's stories for 40 years in this valley," she said. "I'm good at it, too good, and I've been telling Voss's stories without thinking about whose version I was carrying." She met Nora's eyes. "My husband and I came west 25 years ago with nothing. Somebody in this valley helped us when we needed it, and nobody made us feel ashamed of needing it." She looked at the half-built barn at the men working on it. "I should have extended the same consideration to you." A moment of silence. "Will you have coffee?" Nora said. Mrs. Alcott accepted the cup with both hands, and they sat on the porch steps together in the winter sunlight, while the barn went up around them, and the conversation that followed was not exactly friendly. Neither of them was built for easy warmth, but it was honest. And Nora found by the end of it that she respected the older woman in the specific way you respect someone who has examined their own behavior and found it wanting and said so clearly. Carolyn Alcott never came. But Mrs. Alcott, Nora later learned, spent the next 2 weeks telling a different story through Blackwater Ridge, the correct one. It mattered. By the second week of rebuilding, the framing was complete and the roof was on, and Eli walked through the new structure with Marcus in the late afternoon and said after a long silence, "Better than before." Marcus ran his hand along one of the main support beams. "Slate roof, better framing on the interior walls. This one won't burn as fast." He looked at Eli, "Assuming nobody pours kerosene on it." "That particular problem is being addressed," Eli said. It was. The two investigators from Cheyenne had arrived and were working methodically through the evidence, interviewing witnesses, reviewing the Cole statement, looking into the Casper case Nora had mentioned. Voss had not left the territory as instructed. He was at his property with his lawyers, which told you something about the quality of his lawyers and the extent of his resources, and also told you something about how seriously he was taking the investigation. Driscoll testified for 2 hours and emerged looking lighter. Cole testified for 3 hours and emerged looking like a man who had done a hard thing and was glad to have done it. The widow from Casper, whose name was Ruth Haynes, and who had indeed signed over water rights she hadn't understood as part of a brief marriage she'd initiated under circumstances she now recognized, was located by the investigators and was making arrangements to travel to Wyoming. The picture being assembled was larger and more systematic than even Nora had fully anticipated. Eli found her on the porch late one evening reading by lamplight a letter from Franklin Ames open on her knee. "Good news," he said, sitting beside her. "The claim filing is proceeding. Ames says the patent documentation is solid. My father filed everything correctly, and the where designation, while informal, is legally sufficient under territorial law." She set the letter down. "He says 6 weeks, maybe 8. Then the land is mine." Eli looked at the valley below them, dark now, the moon just rising over the ridge, the snow blue-white in the early moonlight. Your father's land, he said. Our valley, she said. He turned to look at her. She was looking at the valley, her profile in the lamplight, clean and steady, and the letter on her knee, and her hands folded over it with the specific stillness of someone at rest in the right place. Nora, he said. She turned. He looked at her for a moment. Just looked. The way you look at something when you're making sure you're seeing it correctly. Then he said, I want to ask you something and I want you to think about it before you answer. All right, she said. When this is settled, the land, the case, all of it, I'd like to build something. He paused. Not just a barn, not just a fence, something that lasts. He held her gaze. I'd like to build it with you. Her expression was very still. Are you asking what I think you're asking? She said. I'm saying I want to build a life with you, a real one, not born from necessity or proximity or because the circumstances pushed us together, though they did, but because I've watched you for 3 months now, and I know who you are, and I choose you. He said it without decoration, without performance. Just the plain truth laid down on the table between them like evidence. And I want to know if you choose me. She looked at him for a long moment, long enough that he was aware of his own breathing and the silence of the valley below and the lamplight between them. Then she said, I knocked on a stranger's door in a blizzard, and you pulled me inside without asking a single question. Yes, he said. I've been choosing you since that night, she said. I just needed you to catch up. His mouth moved, not the almost smile she'd learned to read over 3 months. An actual one, full and rare and entirely unguarded. She reached out and took his hand. They sat on the porch in the Polden, the moonlight listening to the valley breathe, and neither of them said anything else for a long time. They didn't need to. The words had been said. They were the right words. And the silence after them was the best kind, the kind that was not empty but full, not absence but presence, not the silence of two people who had nothing to say, but of two people who had said the most important thing and were resting in the fact of it. Below them, the valley stretched out under the winter moon, cold and quiet, and entirely indifferent to the small human warmth on the porch above it. But it held them anyway, as the land always holds the people who refuse to be moved from it. And somewhere south of them, in a large house with good fires and expensive lawyers and the slowly closing net of a territorial investigation, Dorian Voss sat alone with what remained of his plans. The reckoning was coming. It would arrive before the snow melted. The investigators worked through January without hurry, which was its own kind of statement. Men who worked without hurry were men who believed they had enough. Nora had learned this from watching the mill owners operate the deliberate ones, who moved slowly because they had no reason to rush. The ones who rushed were the ones afraid of what might happen if they didn't close the deal fast. The ones who moved slowly were the ones who knew the outcome was already decided. Calder's men moved slowly. They interviewed 22 people over 3 weeks. They took copies of Nora's documents. They sent correspondence to territorial offices in 3 counties. They visited the Voss property, twice not hostile, visits formal ones, with the specific courtesy that was more unnerving than hostility, because it said the visits were part of a procedure rather than a confrontation. Voss responded through his lawyers, which was the appropriate thing to do, and also Eli observed the move of a man who understood that the confrontational approach had already failed him. He's changing tactics, Eli said one evening near the end of January. He was at the table with Nora, both of them reading him through a land survey document, her through a letter from Ames. He was trying to destroy us. Now he's trying to defend himself. That's a different posture. His lawyers filed a motion to challenge the land claim, Nora said. Ames got the notice this morning. On what grounds? They're arguing that the heir designation is insufficient, that my father's will was informal and not properly witnessed, and that without a formally witnessed document, the patent reverts to uncontested territory. She set the letter down. Ames says it's a weak argument, that territorial land law has provisions for exactly this situation. But it takes time to argue. Everything takes time. She looked at the fire. He's hoping to outlast us, spend us down in legal fees until we have nothing left to fight with. Can he? She was quiet for a moment. Franklin Ames is taking my case on contingency, she said. He believes in it enough to wait for payment until the claim succeeds. She paused. I think he's also motivated by the Casper situation. Ruth Haynes is his cousin. Eli looked at her. You didn't know that when you hired him, he said. I didn't. But the world is smaller than it looks sometimes. She picked up the letter again. He says the motion will be heard in March. He expects to prevail. In the meantime, the criminal investigation continues regardless of the civil claim. Two fronts, Eli said. Two fronts, she agreed. Voss has to win both. We only have to win one. He looked at her steadily. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind was mild tonight, the kind of late January evening that offered a brief reprieve from the worst of the cold, a small mercy of a few degrees. You're not worried, he said. I'm always worried, she said. I'm just better at working alongside the worry than I used to be. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. A gesture that had become over the past weeks as natural and unremarkable as it was important, this specific intimacy of two people who had decided to share the weight of things. We have enough, he said. We have enough, she agreed. She turned her hand over and held on. Outside, the wind was soft and the stars were out, and the valley lay quiet under the winter moon, patient and ancient and entirely indifferent to the legal proceedings of one particular winter, but holding in its frozen earth the land that would, when spring came, finally and irrevocably become her own. And in the cabin, the fire burned, and the night passed, and morning came as it always did, and as it always does, with the particular promise of another day to stand on the right side of things. February arrived with a cold so deep it turned the world into something static and crystalline. Every branch coated, every fence wire, a line of ice, the creek locked completely beneath 2 feet of blue-gray frost. The horses grew their winter coats thick as rugs. The cattle clustered near the windbreaks and steamed in the mornings. The new barn held. Eli walked through it every day, not from anxiety, but from the kind of satisfaction that comes from building something you trust. The slate roof shed snow cleanly. The interior walls, with their improved framing, didn't creak and shudder in the wind the way the old ones had. The stalls were a foot wider, and the tack room was better organized, and the whole structure smelled like new pine and possibility. Nora had hung a small iron hook near the main door for the harness leads, and he noticed it the second day without saying anything, and it was in exactly the right place. He noticed things about her with a regularity that had long since stopped surprising him. The way she took her coffee, hot black 2 cups before anything else. The way she worked through problems by writing about them first, as though her hand knew things her head was still sorting out. The way she sang under her breath sometimes while she was kneading bread. Not songs, he knew something quieter and older. Something that sounded like it came from a place she didn't often speak about. He started leaving small things. A new pen on the table beside her journal when her old one ran dry. A pair of work gloves in a size that actually fit her hands instead of the oversized pair she'd been using. A book he'd traded for in town, one of the 3 she'd mentioned from her mill years. Something she'd read in a break room by the light of a high window while the machines ran. She noticed. She didn't make a production of it. She just looked at each thing with an expression that said she understood exactly what it was and went on. You're a quiet man, she told him one morning. Yes, he agreed. You show things instead of saying them. Mostly. She looked at the pen in her hand, the new one which wrote better than anything she'd had since Pittsburgh, and then at him. I was wrong before, she said, when I said words build things. Were you so when words in the things you don't say build things, she said. It's both. He thought about that. Fair enough, he said. She smiled, and that the full, unguarded smile which she gave rarely and never for performance was itself a kind of language. The best kind. The kind that said everything. He held it for a long time after she turned away. The letter from Franklin Ames came on the 2nd Thursday of February, and it changed everything and nothing at the same time. The land claim had been approved at the territorial level. The challenge filed by Voss's lawyers had been dismissed. The patent was valid. The heir designation was legally sufficient. The Calloway Fork watershed, all 340 acres of it, including the primary spring, the 2 tributary creeks, and the downstream water rights, was formally and irrevocably the property of Nora Calloway. Nora read the letter twice at the table, her face entirely still. Then she stood and walked to the window and looked out at the valley. Eli watched her from across the room and did not speak. After a long time, she said, He built this ranch near it on purpose. Your father. Yes, he could see the spring from the high pasture, Ames says. He filed the claim the same season he filed the homestead. He was protecting the water. She paused. He knew. He was a careful man. I didn't know him, she said. There was no self-pity in it, just the plain truth held out in the light. My mother never talked about him. I grew up with a blank space where a father should have been. She turned from the window. And now I have this, which isn't the same thing, but it's something he left me, something he thought I might need. Eli crossed the room. He came to stand beside her at the window. They looked out together at the valley, his 200 acres, her 340. The overlapping watersheds, the shared sky, the mountains that didn't belong to either of them, and held them both. He was right, Eli said. You needed it. She turned to look at him. So did this valley, she said. He nodded. And then because the moment required it, and because he was a man who showed things rather than said them, but had also learned over the course of a particular winter that some things needed both. He took her face in his hands and kissed her. Not the first time, not tentative, the kiss of two people who had already decided and were now simply continuing. When they pulled apart, she was still looking at him with those dark, attentive eyes, and her hands were at his chest, and outside the window, the valley lay cold and bright under the February sky. We're going to win this, she said softly. Not a question. We already have, he said. The rest is just paperwork. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she laughed, the real laugh, the full one, the bells in winter sound of it, and pressed her forehead against his shoulder. He wrapped his arms around her and held on. Outside the valley held them back. March came in like a verdict. The snow began to loosen its grip on the valley by degrees, the south-facing slopes first, then the lower meadows, then the creek banks where the ice cracked and shifted, and finally gave way with sounds like distant rifle shots heard across open country. The Calloway Fork ran clear and fast under the February sun, and the ranchers downstream had opened their irrigation gates for the first time in months and watched the water come, and it came the way it always had, unimpeded, clean, entirely indifferent to who thought they owned it. The hearing was set for the 14th of March. It was not a trial, not yet. It was a territorial hearing conducted before a judge from Cheyenne who had been assigned specifically because of the conflict of interest concern with local officials. The charges were formal now: fraud in the inducement of a contractual arrangement conspiracy to deprive an heir of their legal property rights, arson, and 2 counts of attempted murder, one for the blizzard night and one for the fire. There were also attached to the main proceeding the preliminary documents relating to the Casper case, which had grown from a secondary thread into something that was threatening to become its own separate proceeding. Franklin Ames had been right. The pattern once documented was worse than a single incident. Nora arrived in Blackwater Ridge on the morning of the 14th with Eli beside her and Tom and Marcus behind them and the folded file of documents under her arm, and she was not afraid. She had been afraid. She remembered the specific quality of it, the midnight hours after the fire when she'd lain in the loft and felt the walls of the future closing in. The moments in town when she'd held her chin up through the specific social violence of women who had decided she was worth diminishing. The night the riders came and she'd stood on the porch and heard her own voice come out steady when her hands were shaking. Fear was information. She'd learned that from Eli, who had learned it the hard way 8 years ago on a ranch beside a drying creek. Fear told you what mattered. It didn't get to tell you what to do. She'd stopped letting it. The courtroom was the church, the only building in Blackwater Ridge large enough to hold the assembled valley, which had apparently decided in its collective wisdom that this particular proceeding required an audience. Every pew was filled. People stood along the walls. Mrs. Alcott sat in the third row, spine-straight expression, composed there by choice which Nora had registered and filed away. Carolyn Alcott was not present. Judge Harold Denning was a tall man with iron gray hair and the specific expression of someone who had heard a great many stories and had developed the ability to weigh them against each other without passion. He was not warm, but he was visibly fair in the way that mattered, the way that meant he would follow the evidence wherever it went, regardless of who it pointed toward. Voss arrived with 2 lawyers and a confidence that was slightly more effortful than usual. Nora saw it immediately, the fractional extra work his composure was doing. She had watched enough powerful men operate to know the difference between natural authority and performed authority. Voss had always performed his. The performance was excellent, but it required energy. And in the past 2 months, facing down an investigation that had proven more thorough than he'd anticipated, some of that energy had been spent. He looked at her across the courtroom when he entered. She held his gaze. He looked away first. The hearing lasted 2 days. Ames presented the civil case in 4 hours on the first morning, concise documented building, from the original advertisement, through the contract irregularity, through the Cheyenne filing to the final approval of the claim. The land was Nora's. That was established by the end of the first session, and Voss's lawyers knew it. Their motions and objections were procedural delaying tactics, the kind that generated paper without changing substance. The criminal case was different. That took the rest of the first day and all of the second morning. Cole testified. He was calm and specific, the way people are when they're telling the truth about something difficult. Not polished, not rehearsed, just clear. He described the night of the fire with the precision of a man who had spent 2 months living with what he'd done and had decided that the only version of himself he could respect was the one who told the complete truth. Driscoll testified. He was briefer, just the fire, just the facts, just his name on an order he'd received and carried out and regretted. His hands were folded on the railing in front of him, and he didn't look at Voss. Voss's lawyers cross-examined both men for a combined 6 hours. They found minor inconsistencies in peripheral details, the exact position of the riders on the ridge, the precise time the order was given, and pointed to them with the energy of men who had no better option. The inconsistencies were real and minor, and meant nothing about the substance of what both men had described. Ruth Haynes testified via a written deposition read into the record by Ames. She was not present, she was in poor health, and the journey from Casper had not been possible, but her account was precise and documented and added a dimension to the proceedings that Voss's lawyers had clearly not anticipated as fully as they should have. The pattern. 2 women, 2 land claims, 2 arranged circumstances, 1 systematic and premeditated scheme. Marcus Webb testified about the fire damage and the smell of kerosene. Tom Reeves testified about Cole's arrival at his store and the information Cole had provided. Samuel Garrett testified about the water rights and what Voss's acquisition of the Calloway Fork would have meant for downstream properties. On the second afternoon, Eli testified. He testified about the 8 years, about the Sweetwater property, and the diverted creek and the debt that had followed, and the family that had scattered. He said Voss's name in connection with the Sweetwater in public for the first time in a courtroom in front of a judge who wrote it down and did not dismiss it. He said it clearly and without drama, just the facts in order with dates where he had them. Voss's lawyers objected immediately. The objection was technical. The Sweetwater situation was outside the scope of the current proceedings, which concerned specific acts committed against Eli Strand and Nora Calloway in the current county. Judge Denning considered the objection for a moment. Overruled, he said. It speaks to intent and pattern. Continue. Eli continued. When he was done, he stepped down and came back to sit beside Nora, and she put her hand over his on the pew between them, and he turned his over and held it without looking at her, his eyes on the judge, and that was enough. Voss took the stand in the late afternoon of the second day. It was the moment the courtroom had been waiting for, and the silence when he stood was absolute, the kind of silence that has texture that you can feel against your skin. He was still composed, still smooth. He answered questions in complete sentences with measured pauses between them. He denied everything he could deny and qualified everything else into something unrecognizable. He was a skilled performer, and there were moments when the performance was good enough that Nora could see people in the pews beginning to think maybe it's more complicated than it looks. And then Ames stood up for cross-examination. He started with the advertisement, specifically with the name D.C. Voss and the process by which the advertisement had been placed and through which Nora's name had been obtained by the marriage broker. Voss answered carefully. Ames asked about the genealogy service, the one that had located potential heirs to dormant land claims, including the Calloway patent. Voss acknowledged retaining the service. He said it was standard business practice to research land records. Including heir records, Ames asked. Research is research, Voss said. And when the research indicated that Nora Calloway of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, was the likely heir to the Callaway Fork patent, a parcel of land adjacent to your own holdings that controls the primary watershed for this valley, what did you do with that information? A pause. I pursued standard acquisition strategies, Voss said, which included arranging a marriage or proposal under a name that does not correspond to your legal identity. A technicality of initials. Yes or no, Mr. Voss? Did you arrange a marriage proposal to Nora Calloway under the name DC? Voss, knowing that the contract signed under that name might be challenged as legally insufficient because you intended to complete the rights transfer before any challenge could be mounted. The silence in the courtroom was different now. Voss's lawyer stood, objected, sustained. Ames rephrased, asked again differently, got an answer that said nothing and said everything. He worked through it for 40 minutes. He was methodical and patient and entirely without performance. And by the end of it, the room understood exactly what had happened and why not, because Ames had proved every element beyond reasonable doubt, which was for a trial, but because the shape of it was clear enough that the room could see it. Judge Denning declared a brief recess. When he returned, he announced that based on the evidence presented, he was referring the criminal charges arson, attempted murder, fraud, conspiracy to the Territorial Circuit Court for formal trial. He set a date in May. He reaffirmed the validity of the Callaway land claim. He issued a formal order requiring Voss to cease and desist from any actions that could be construed as interference with the operations of the Callaway Fork property. He looked at Voss over the rims of his glasses. Mr. Voss, he said, I would encourage you to consult with your attorneys about the wisdom of contesting the criminal referral. The evidentiary record is substantial and the pattern documented is clear. Cooperation at this stage would be to your considerable benefit. Voss looked at the judge. His expression for the first time in 2 days was unreadable, in the way of a man whose performance has stopped working. He nodded once. Thank you, Your Honor, he said. And that was that. Outside the church in the March sunshine, Nora stood with Eli and let the feeling wash through her. It was not triumph. She had expected triumph, had anticipated it, had rehearsed the feeling in her mind during the long months of building toward this. But what she felt was quieter than that, more like the specific relief of a weight that you've been carrying so long you'd forgotten it was weight. Marcus Webb shook her hand. Tom Reeves shook her hand. Samuel Garrett shook her hand and said gruffly that he owed her a debt he didn't intend to forget. Mrs. Alcott came out of the church and crossed to her without hesitation. Well done, she said simply. Thank you for coming, Nora said. I've been coming to this church for 20 years, Mrs. Alcott said. I figured I might as well use it for something that mattered. She looked at Eli, then at Nora. You make a good team. She walked away toward her buggy without waiting for a response, which was entirely in character and somehow exactly right. Franklin Ames stayed for an hour going over what came next, the May trial. The continued civil proceedings, the documents Nora would need to file to formally take possession of the Callaway Fork land. He spoke to her with the respect of a man who had been more than competent in a courtroom and knew it, and who was giving that same respect to the person who had made the case possible. You'll need to be involved throughout the trial, he told her. It won't be brief. I'll be here, she said. Good. He looked at the mountain ridge above the town. The water rights will take longer to sort out. The downstream claims the historical usage agreement ends. That's probably another year of process. But the land is mine. The land is yours, he confirmed. That part is done. When he left, Nora stood with Eli in the main street of Blackwater Ridge, and the afternoon sun was low and warm, and the snow was dripping from the church eaves in a steady percussion, and the valley around them was beginning after months of ice and dark to remember what it was supposed to become. A year, she said, for the water rights. Maybe more, Eli said. You're all right with that. I told you I'd choose you every time, he said. That includes the inconvenient parts. She looked at him. He looked back at her with that particular steadiness that had become over the course of a winter the most reliable thing in her life. We should build something, she said. We are building something. She looked at the road that led north toward the ranch. The cabin is yours. It's been yours for 8 years. When we combine the properties, when I move the formal claim, she paused. I want it to be ours, built together, not me arriving into something that already existed. He was quiet for a moment. A new cabin, he said, bigger than the current one, with a proper kitchen and a sitting room and a bedroom that doesn't have a loft. She looked at her hands. If that's what you want, it's what I want, he said. Then we'll build it in the spring when the ground thaws. The ground's already starting to thaw, he said. She looked up at him. The sun was in his eyes and he was squinting against it slightly, and the expression on his face was the one she'd been learning to read all winter, the one that had no performance in it at all. Then we can start next week, she said. He nodded, and that was how they did it, not with a proposal on bent knee in the church, not with rings and ceremony, and the whole elaborate vocabulary of expectation. Just two people standing in the March sunshine deciding in specific and practical terms what they were going to build together, though there was eventually a ceremony. The wedding was in April. Tom Reeves officiated because the Valley still didn't have a settled minister, and Tom was the closest thing to institutional authority that Blackwater Ridge possessed, and both Eli and Nora trusted him completely, which was the only qualification that mattered. The whole Valley came, not because they'd been required to, there was no requirement, just an announcement Tom had posted on the store window, but because by April most of Blackwater Ridge had made a decision about where they stood on the question of Eli Strand and Nora Calloway, and where they stood was beside them. Marcus Webb wore his second-best coat and stood near the front and looked like a man who was not going to cry, but was working hard at it. Mrs. Alcott brought food, a considerable quantity of it, prepared and transported, without being asked, which was its own form of apology and its own form of welcome. Even Samuel Garrett, who was not a sentimental man, stayed for the entire afternoon. They stood outside in the April sun, with the mountains still white on their upper faces and the valley below already showing the first pale green of new grass. And Tom read the words he'd prepared, and Eli and Nora each said yes to the most important question. And when Eli kissed his bride, the valley erupted in a sound that you could have heard probably as far as Voss's property to the south. Whether he heard it or not was his own concern. He had enough concerns of his own. The trial in May went as Ames had predicted. The criminal conviction on the arson charge was certain, the evidence was too solid, the witnesses too credible, the pattern too thoroughly documented. The fraud and conspiracy charges were more complex and would ultimately be resolved in a settlement negotiation that stretched into summer, involving the return of certain land parcels and the settlement of claims from Ruth Haynes and at least two other women whose stories had surfaced during the investigation. Dorian Voss did not go to prison in the end. His lawyers were skilled enough and his connections broad enough, and the territorial legal system in 1887 was what it was. But he was convicted on the arson charge and fined heavily. His water rights agreements with downstream properties were renegotiated under supervision of the court. His political relationships, which had been built on the assumption of impunity, became substantially less useful once impunity had been publicly and formally revoked. He sold his Wyoming holdings within 2 years and moved to Denver, where he presumably found new circumstances and new strategies, because men like Voss rarely stopped entirely. They just found different terrain. But he left this valley. That was what mattered. They broke ground on the new house in the third week of April. Marcus led the construction. He'd been planning in it since winter, apparently, which was the kind of thing Marcus did without announcement, and the valley helped because by this point, helping Eli and Nora had become something the valley did. The house went up on the bench above the two combined properties, high enough to see the full sweep of the valley, the Calloway Fork Creek visible in its entirety from the south-facing window, the mountains close enough to seem protective rather than threatening. It was larger than the cabin and smaller than a statement. It had the kitchen Nora had specified, with enough room for a real table and the good cast iron she'd accumulated over winter. It had a sitting room with a fireplace that Marcus built from creek stone, each piece chosen for its specific fit. It had a bedroom with a window that faced east toward the first light. The front porch faced the valley. That was Eli's only specific request, and Nora had made it a priority without discussion, because she understood, without being told, why a man who had spent 8 years watching the valley from a porch would want his next porch to do the same. They moved in on a Saturday in June. They carried their things from the cabin, which they'd keep for guests or for seasons when extra hands were needed, across the bench to the new house, and they arranged everything with the ease of two people who had spent months learning each other's rhythms. And by afternoon, the house smelled like pine and wood smoke, and the particular combination of two lives moving into the same space. That evening, they sat on the new porch in the long summer light. The valley stretched below them, the green of it, in June, the specific lush green of Wyoming high country. In the good months, the creek bright and fast in the middle distance, the cattle in the lower pasture, the horses in the near field. The mountains held the sky. Do you think about what would have happened, Eli asked, if you hadn't knocked? Sometimes, Nora said, but not for long. Why not? Because I did knock, she said, and you opened the door. That's what happened. The version where I didn't isn't a version I live in. She looked at the valley. You told me once that you'd choose me every time. I think about that. It's still true. I know. She leaned against him and he put his arm around her shoulders. I think my father would have liked this. He picked the land, Eli said. He knew what he was building toward. He just didn't live long enough to see it. You're seeing it for both of you. She was quiet for a moment. That's a good way to think about it, she said softly. They sat as the sun went down and the mountains turned gold, and then pink, and then the specific deep blue of high country evening. The creek below them caught the last light and held it for a moment, silver and running before the dark came down. Somewhere on the ridge, a hawk called out the same cry they'd been hearing since winter, that sharp, defiant sound, and then fell silent. Nora looked at the stars coming out. She thought about the mill in Pittsburgh and the 12-hour days and the women who had disappeared into the noise of it, and she thought about the train journey west and the letter she'd read 100 times, and the hope she hadn't allowed herself to name, and she thought about the blizzard and the fear and the door and the man who had opened it without asking a single question. She thought about everything she'd built and everything she'd lost and everything she'd recovered and the way those three things had turned out to be parts of the same story rather than separate ones. She had come west looking for a future. She had found something better than the future she'd imagined. This was worth everything, she said quietly. Yes, Eli said. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. They were both looking at the same valley and they both knew it was true, and the silence that followed was the best kind, full and warm and holding everything. Below them, the valley breathed. The creek ran. The cattle moved in the lower pasture with the easy patience of animals that are exactly where they belong. And on the bench above it all, in a house built by a community out of something harder and more durable than luck, two people who had refused to disappear sat together in the summer dark and held what they'd made. It was enough. More than enough. It was home. But let the story be told in full. The first spring on the combined property revealed itself slowly the way good things do. Nora understood the land in legal terms, the documents, the acreage, the water rights. But understanding a thing legally is different from understanding it with your hands on a clear April morning when the world is coming back to life after winter. She rode the Calloway Fork parcel for the first time in late April. Eli rode beside her and said very little, letting her see. The spring that fed the fork was at the north end of the property, half a mile up a draw cut into the bench. Larger than she'd expected, a true artesian spring welling from deep below the limestone, clear and cold and constant. She sat her horse at the edge of it and watched the water move and thought about her father standing here 20 years ago, looking at this same spring, making the decision to file a claim on the land that held it. He would have understood exactly what this meant, she said, for the valley, for everyone downstream. He took the homestead because of the spring, Eli said. The parcel is too specific for coincidence. A man doesn't file on this exact location without knowing what he's holding. She looked at the water. He chose not to sell it. He was protecting something. His daughter came, she said softly. They rode back down in the morning ride, the valley opening up below them. Their combined land spread in the spring green, and it was so exactly what she had hoped for when she'd read the advertisement on a winter afternoon in Pittsburgh that she didn't try to say it. Some things are made smaller by naming. The summer was good work. They ran a combined herd on the upper bench, and the hayfields along the fork bottom produced better than either property had done separately. Nora learned cattle with the systematic patience she brought to everything, watching, practicing, adding competence to competence, until one afternoon she worked a steer out of a gully with the confidence of someone who had been doing it for years rather than months. Eli watched her from 50 yards away and felt something that didn't need explaining settle in his chest. Voss called you plain, he said that evening. She looked up. I've been thinking about it. What he saw was someone he couldn't read, someone not performing for him. Men like that call that a deficiency in the other person rather than a limitation in themselves. I know, she said. I wanted to say it out loud. She looked at him with the full steady attention she gave to things worth looking at. You're a quiet man, she said, but you say the things that matter. I'm trying to be better at that. You're very good at it. She went back to her book. He stood in the kitchen for a moment in the evening light, aware of the specific luck of his particular life, the long, unfair stretch of it, and the good part that followed, and felt something without a name that lived in the general family of gratitude, but without the debt that gratitude sometimes carries. Just this is right. Ruth Haynes came to Wyoming in July for the civil proceedings at some meetings. She was small 61 with a face that had moved past pretty into something more durable. Nora took her to the Fork Spring the second day and they sat on a flat rock beside the water. He did the same thing to you, Ruth said. Yes, except you saw it coming. I smelled it. I didn't understand it clearly until later. A pause. You were alone, I wasn't. That's the real difference. Ruth looked at her with the long, honest assessment of someone who has been through enough to recognize truth when it sits beside her. You're right, she said. That's the difference. Before she left for the train, Ruth handed Nora a small package, a journal old and worn with Charles Calloway's name in faded ink on the inside cover. The Casper lawyer found it in property records, Ruth said. It should have come to you years ago. Nora opened it that night by the kitchen lamp. Her father's handwriting was larger than hers, more emphatic. He wrote about the journey west, the land claimed the spring. Near the end, the handwriting looser. I have not seen her. I left before she was born, and I have not gone back. I am not proud of this. I tell myself it was for her sake that I had nothing to offer, that starting over was the only honest thing. Maybe that is true. Maybe some of it is. But I am putting her name on this land. Whatever she is, wherever she is, this belongs to her. The spring belongs to her. The water is hers. I may not be able to give her much, but I can give her this. Nora. Her name is Nora. She held the journal against her chest for a long time. He had known her name. He had written it down. He had given her the most valuable thing he had. She set it on the shelf above the kitchen table where she could see it every morning. Eli was awake when she came to bed. He didn't ask. He just took her hand in the dark, and she held on, and the valley held them both, and she felt fully and completely the specific peace of a woman who knows exactly where she is. Here, this person, this life. Her father's land, her valley their home. She thought, this is what he gave me, not just the land, not just the water. The possibility of this. The valley remembered everything. It remembered the blizzard that had come in December and the woman who had walked through it. It remembered the fire in January and the two people who had run from it into the car and then had walked back. It remembered the meeting in the church and the hearing before the judge and the day Voss rode south for the last time. It remembered all of it in the way that land remembers things, not in words but in consequences. In the water that still ran clean from the Fork Spring, in the downstream properties that still irrigated from it, in the valley's knowledge of itself, its understanding of what had almost been taken and what had been kept. Marcus Webb was rebuilding something on the east side of his property that summer, a second forge for expanded work. He came by the Strand Calloway place on a Tuesday to borrow a level and stayed for dinner, and afterward they sat on the porch in the long evening light, and Marcus said something Nora would think about for years. The thing about this valley, he said, is that it looks like it takes care of itself, but it doesn't. People take care of it, and when people stop, when they let one man buy up all the water, or one family own all the contracts, then it stops working. He looked at the mountains. What you did wasn't just for yourselves, you know that? I know, Nora said. I don't think you fully know, Marcus said. Not yet. Ask me in 10 years. She thought about that later, lying awake in the summer dark, Eli's breathing steady beside her. The valley outside, the creek, the spring at the north end of the property running where it had always run, doing what it had always done. She would ask Marcus in 10 years. She expected his answer would be the same as it was now said, with more years behind it. You held the line. That mattered. That keeps mattering. She rolled over and looked at Eli asleep in the dim room and thought about the shape of a life built on the right foundation, not ease, not luck, But choosing right when choosing right was hard, and sticking to the choice when it cost something. She thought about her father writing her name in a journal in a cabin on a bench above this valley, believing that whoever she turned out to be would be worth the land he was leaving her. She thought he was right. And then she slept deeply and without dreams in the house they'd built above her father's valley, with the sound of the creek in the distance and the mountains standing guard over everything they'd made. What is a home? It is not a building. Buildings burn as they had learned. It is not a piece of land. Land can be sold, stolen, contested, legislated away. A home is the decision made every day to be present in the place and the life you've chosen, to show up for the work, to hold the people beside you, to stay. Eli Strand had made that decision alone for 8 years, and it had been enough to survive on. Then Nora Calloway had knocked on his door, and he had made the same decision in a different direction, toward rather than away, and it had become something else entirely. Something with a future in it. On a September morning in the first year after the hearing, Nora stood at the kitchen window with her coffee and watched Eli come in from the barn's snow on his shoulders, an early snowlight, an exploratory, the mountain's reminder that the cold was still out there, and she thought about the December morning she'd arrived. How close she'd been to the end of herself. How the light in his window had looked from 2 miles off in the dark. He came through the door. He saw her at the window, and something in his face settled the specific expression of a man who has come home and found everything where it should be. "Snow," he said. "Just a little," she said. "It'll pass." He hung his coat and crossed the kitchen and stood beside her at the window, and they looked out at the light snow falling on their valley, their combined, hard-won, carefully protected valley, and neither of them said anything for a while. Then he said, "That's a good view." "Yes," she said, "it is." She leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they stood like that in the kitchen window in the early September snow, and the day began around them, the horses moving in the pasture, the cattle along the lower fence, the creek catching what little light there was, and it was good. Simply, entirely, unremarkably good. That was the other thing about home, that Nora had not expected how ordinary it would feel. How the extraordinary events that had led here, the blizzard, the fire, the legal battle, the slow, deliberate dismantling of a man who had tried to erase her, would become over time simply the story of how they'd gotten here. Not something to be constantly reckoned with, just the history that had made the present possible. She had come west looking for a life she could choose. She had chosen it. She was still choosing it. Every morning, every time she stood at this window with her coffee, every time she worked beside this man in this valley under this particular sky. That was the whole of it. That was everything. Outside, the light snow fell and passed, and the September sun came out and touched the mountains in the valley below, held the light the way the valley had always held things, patiently, permanently, without asking for anything in return. It had been there before them. It would be there after them. But for now, for this long, good, hard one now, it was theirs. And they were its, and that was enough. More than enough. It was everything. A final accounting. Tom Reeves continued to run the general store for another 20 years, and was known until the end as a man whose word you could take to the bank, a reputation he'd always had, and which he wore more visibly after the winter, and he'd chosen to keep it when keeping it cost something. Marcus Webb expanded his forge. He trained 2 apprentices, both sons of valley ranchers, and the Blackwater Ridge smithy became the best-equipped shop in the territory within a decade. He never left the valley and never wanted to. Samuel Garrett's operation thrived. The water from the Calloway Fork that had fed his lower fields for generations continued to flow, and he knew exactly who to thank for it. He said so every time he saw Nora, until she had to tell him that once was plenty and he could stop. He didn't stop. Ruth Haynes received a substantial civil settlement from Voss's estate and returned to Casper, where she hired a lawyer of her own and spent several years working with territorial officials to close the loopholes in land law that had allowed the scheme to operate. She wrote to Nora twice a year for the rest of her life. Anders Cole became a working hand on a ranch in the northern reaches of the territory, as far from Voss's former sphere of influence as a man could get while remaining in Wyoming. He wrote to Nora once briefly to say that he thought about the fire most nights and that he hoped she was well. She wrote back to say she was. Colt Driscoll served his sentence and left Wyoming entirely. No one in the valley heard from him again. Franklin Ames continued to practice law in Cheyenne. He handled the Callaway Fork water rights negotiations himself over the course of 14 months, and at the end of it produced a set of agreements that codified the downstream rights in terms that would be cited in territorial water law cases for 30 years. He considered it his best work. He was probably right. And Dorian Voss. He sold his Wyoming holdings within 2 years of the conviction as anticipated. He moved to Denver, then to San Francisco. Then, according to the one account that reached Blackwater Ridge, carried in by a rancher who'd read it in a newspaper back east, where he apparently spent his remaining years in reduced but not destitute circumstances, having been too careful a man to lose everything and too thoroughly exposed to recover what he'd had. He was not remembered well in the valley, but he was not thought about often either, which was all things considered the appropriate proportion. The Callaway Fork Spring ran for as long as anyone living could remember. It ran through dry summers and hard winters and the ordinary and extraordinary crises of a century that would bring changes to the territory that neither Eli nor Nora could have imagined from their porch in the September of 1887. The land held, and on the bench above the valley on the property that bore two names on the deed and one name on the fork that watered it, the house they'd built together stood against the weather, the way good things stand, not by being impervious to it, but by being built well enough to weather it and remain. And Eli Strand and Nora Calloway. Nora Strand legally, though she kept Calloway on the land deed because it was her father's name, and it belonged there, lived the life they had chosen on the ground they had kept. It was hard and good and real. It was enough. It was always precisely enough.